Hever Castle is one of the most remarkable historic houses in Britain. It's got 700 years of turbulent history, marked by glitz and glamour, as well as decline and fall. Today I'm going to give you a whirlwind tour and show you my favourite bits. Let's go!
First off, here's a potted history of the place. At the start of the 13th century, this site was home to a timber Mott and Bailey castle. This would have been quite a basic structure, a timber hall with just a few outbuildings.
But in 1271, during the reign of King Edward I, the design was taken up a notch. Permission was granted to strengthen the house at Hever with a wall of stone and lime, and to crenellate it in the manner of a castle. So, a gatehouse was built to replace the original timber hall.
And it was from this gatehouse, which still stands today, that more additions were made in the 14th century. Soon there were crenellated walls with towers on the corners. They added a moat and even a great hall.
It's hard to imagine, but in the 14th century, the exterior walls would have been whitewashed with a mixture of powdered chalk and water, and even decorated in bright, bold colours. This wasn't just to make the castle more imposing, it was also to protect the stone. Across the years, all sorts of people have lived here at Hever Castle. Since the 13th century, it's passed through 37 different owners and 13 families. It was originally the home of William de Hever, who gave the castle its name. And in the 15th century, the Fiennes family lived here, the ancestors of the great explorer Sir Ranulph Fiennes.
Of course, the most famous of Hever's residents were the Boleyn family, who then spelt their name B-U-L-L-E-N. The castle was bought by Geoffrey Boleyn in 1462, and it was his grandson, Thomas Boleyn, who lived here and raised his 3 children, Mary, Anne and George. And it was Anne Boleyn, the middle child, who became Henry VIII's second wife.
Spoiler alert, the Boleyns' rise to power didn't last long. In fact, it was cut brutally short when Anne and George Boleyn were accused of adultery and incest and executed in 1536. Their father, Thomas Boleyn, was shunned at court and died 2 years later.
With the Boleyns out the picture, Hever Castle came into the possession of King Henry, and in 1540 Henry gave it to his 4th wife after he annulled the marriage. This was Anne of Cleves, also known as the Flanders Mare.
Since the Tudor period, Hever passed through the hands of several different families and gradually fell into decline. It may well have fallen into total disrepair had it not been snapped up by the richest man in America, William Waldorf Astor.
Astor threw his immense fortune into refurbishing and reimagining Hever as a grand Tudor fortress, filling it with ornate oak panelling and magnificent Tudor portraits. He created a lavish family home that could indulge his passion for history and impress his VIP guests.
So what we're looking at today is a real hodgepodge of 700 years of tweaks and alterations. Even the moat has caused all sorts of problems in the past. We're on quite low ground here, and as the moat used to join the River Eden, it would spill over the banks and flood the castle's courtyard.
Of course, Astor sorted all of that out in his renovations, and in 1906 he took out the crumbling brick bridge and reinstated this wooden drawbridge, which can still be raised. No doubt useful for any guests who had turned up late.
This gatehouse is home to 2 of the oldest surviving portcullises in England, one of which can still be operated. And here in the castle courtyard, you can clearly see the difference between the 13th century gatehouse and the timber-framed Tudor additions. In Anne Boleyn's day, there would have been 4 doorways on each side rather than the 2 we see today. The east wing was where the servants worked and slept, and the west wing had the private rooms of the Boleyn family. This is the 13th century gatehouse, the oldest part of the castle. This is where William de Hever would have eaten, slept and entertained his guests, and it was pretty luxurious. It even had a guardrobe, aka a loo, which emptied directly down into the moat. Look out below! Sorry.
It's a pretty gruesome collection in here. There are executioner swords, pieces of armour and even instruments of torture. And one of the strangest pieces are these scolds' bridles. These were designed to be worn by outspoken women, a bit like myself, who were suspected to be witches, shrews or scolds. Next we're heading to the inner hall. In the Boleyn's day, this was the kitchen where great feasts were prepared. And Thomas Boleyn even had high ceilings installed to help dissipate the smoke.
Of course, it doesn't look much like a kitchen these days, as much of this panelling and woodwork was installed by William Waldorf Astor, who used this as his grand reception room.
Astor employed 748 men to refurbish the castle, and he was careful to preserve as much of the original structure as possible, with strict instructions to use historically authentic tools, materials and techniques where possible.
But my favourite detail in this room is this portrait of Elizabeth de Valois, who was the third wife of Philip II of Spain. Now, it's a beautiful portrait of Elizabeth, but what's most interesting is this pear-shaped pearl hanging in her hair.
This pearl is La Peregrina. It's believed to be one of the most symmetrical natural pearls ever found. It was also owned by Queen Mary I, and it stayed in the hands of royalty, Hollywood royalty that is, when Richard Burton bought it for Elizabeth Taylor.
And the pearl actually returned to Hever Castle when Elizabeth Taylor wore it whilst filming here at the 1969 film Anne of 1,000 Days. Isn't that neat?
The other bit of bling to look out for in this room is this gilt bronze clock on the mantelpiece. This is a replica of what Henry VIII gave Anne Boleyn on the morning of their marriage in 1532.
I know historians talk all about the significance of this representing the time finally coming or time running out, but for me it's far more simple. Just hours before the wedding, Henry gave Anne a clock. I think he's saying, please don't be late. And who can blame him? Caterers are expensive.
The next stop on our tour is the drawing room. Originally used in Tudor time as domestic offices, this had a new lease of life in 1905. For William Waldorf Astor kitted it out with this extravagant Elizabethan-style panelling, made from oak and holly.
This is the room where Astor would have schmoozed many of his famous friends. We know that Queen Elizabeth II, Winston Churchill and Sir Arthur Conan Doyle were among his guests. You can picture the scene in here. Astor here with all his pals, a few dukes, a few earls, all drinking champagne, gin and tonics perhaps, and all making lots of hearty jokes. A whale of a time, in fact.
They were entertained lavishly, and I'm sure they were impressed by Astor's little surprise behind this door. He transformed the medieval turret into his very own drinks cupboard.
Bottoms up.
After a few bottles of champagne, Astor brought his guests into the dining room. In Tudor times, this was the Great Hall, initially open right up to the roof rafters. The Boleyns would have dined in this room, and it was here that they entertained Henry VIII and his retinue.
My favourite thing in this room is this impressive gilt lock. This belonged to Henry VIII. The king was so paranoid about assassination, he always travelled with a locksmith, and it was this lock that was fitted to his bedroom wherever he stayed, and then removed when the royal party moved on. Now, if there's one lesson you must take away from a visit to Hever Castle, it's that you must never run up the stairs, for some of these steps, like this one, are different depths.
This wasn't because it was poorly designed or hurriedly built. This was, like in many medieval castles, an ingenious safety feature.
The idea was that if you lived here, you would know which steps were the odd ones, but for invaders, they would be thrown off balance, trip up and give the defenders a crucial advantage.
The next stop on the tour is my favourite room of the whole castle, Anne Boleyn's bedroom.
Anne Boleyn was probably born in 1501 and she spent her childhood here at Hever Castle, and historians think that this was probably her bedroom.
It seems that Anne was fond of Hever. Even when she was a young woman and courting Henry VIII, Anne would often return here. In fact, 7 of the king's love letters were sent to Anne while she was staying at Hever in 1528.
And here she is, wearing her famous bee pendant. She has a daring French-style hood revealing her dark hair. As a young woman, Anne was considered to be intelligent and witty, if not traditionally beautiful. The Venetian ambassador described Anne as not one of the handsomest women in the world. She is of middling stature with a swarthy complexion, long neck, wide mouth, bosom not much raised, and in fact has nothing but the king's great appetite, and her eyes, which are black and beautiful.
Some of Anne's most personal possessions are on display here at Hever Castle. In this room you can see 2 beautifully illuminated prayer books, which were signed and annotated by Anne herself.
These kind of personal prayer books were popular in England from the 13th century until the Reformation. They earned the name the Book of Hours from the short services to the Virgin Mary, which were read at 8 fixed hours during the day, including matins and vespers.
It's incredible to imagine Anne Boleyn walking these corridors, and of course Henry would have visited on several occasions as they were courting. As Henry would have been given the grandest rooms available, he probably stayed in this room when he came to visit.
So, after being lavishly fed and watered by the Boleyn family with a great feast of pies, game, roasted meats, custards and jellies, King Henry would have probably climbed into this bed and snuggled up to sleep, perhaps dreaming of Anne Boleyn or glory in France, and probably snoring quite a lot, I imagine. Hey, that's private! This bed dates from 1540 and it's a tester bed. The term derives from the Latin word testa, meaning head, because these beds were headed by the solid wooden canopy suspended above it. Cosy. Look, I do love Greensleeves, but can you play Wonderball?
Next up we're heading to the staircase gallery, built in around 1506 by Thomas Boleyn. The gem in this room is this portrait of Mary Queen of Scots in mourning.
This portrait was recently discovered in France and is believed to have come from the studio of François Clouet, a French Renaissance miniaturist and painter. It's thought that Mary's white mourning gowns were because of the recent death of 3 close family members.
This is probably Hever Castle's most famous room, the Long Gallery. It was built in the 16th century and extends across the entire width of the castle. Here the Boleyns might have entertained guests, displayed art collections and even taken exercise.
The panelling in this room dates from the 16th century, but the meringue-like ceiling was another Astor addition. It was made in London and brought to Hever on a steam train. Astor even had the train tracks extended, just so the ceiling could be installed. The most exciting thing about this room, though, are the 18 original portraits on the wall. These tell the epic saga from the Wars of the Roses all the way through to the Reformation, aka a lot of family drama.
Most of what we see at Hever is really the work of William Waldorf Astor, and he spent a lot of time on re-landscaping the gardens too.
From these dizzying heights, you can see all the re-landscaping that Astor did in the early 1900s. You can see the maze just next to the castle, and beyond that, the Italian garden.
He had 800 men contracted to excavate the 38-acre lake, and they were instructed in December 1904 to carry on the works regularly and continuously by day and night, except on Sundays, when so ordered.
So, there you have it, the magnificent history of Hever Castle in a nutshell. Thanks for watching. Today I'm at one of the most fascinating Roman sites in Britain, the Roman baths in the glorious city of Bath. But don't worry, this is not another dreaded Latin lesson. I'm here to take you, the subscribers of the History Hit YouTube channel, through the best bits of the history without the boring bits. We'll be looking at everything from trendy hairstyles, sacrificial altars. We'll get to grips with ancient curses, beguiling myths and front page news discoveries. I'll even be showing you where our ancestors got it wrong with typos and botched jobs, which landed them in, well, a lot of hot water. So gather your rubber ducks and grab a towel. It's time to dive headfirst into the remarkable history of the Roman baths. You might know Bath as one of the most elegant cities in the world. It's home to the best Georgian architecture in Britain, and its history is peppered with parading and politeness. But it wasn't always like this. In fact, the story of Bath started with some very muddy pigs.
It all started in 863 BC with a guy called Prince Bladud. He was a British prince who, whilst being educated in Athens, contracted leprosy. On his return to England, he was banished from the kingdom due to this incurable disease.
All Bladud had for company was a herd of pigs, who also caught his skin condition. But one day, something remarkable happened. The pigs came across a patch of hot, muddy water, and Bladud thought nothing of this until he realised the pigs became cured of their leprosy. Observing this miracle, Bladud then bathed in the springs himself, and he too was cured by this healing water. Legend has it that in gratitude he built the city of Bath around the springs.
Whether the legend is true or not, there are 3 naturally occurring hot springs in the area, and the local population has enjoyed the springs since at least the Iron Age.
This is the site of the original sacred spring, and it has naturally hot water at pretty toasty temperatures of 46 degrees C. 240,000 gallons of water rises here daily, as it has done for thousands of years. And according to my calculations, that's enough water to fill over 14,000 bathtubs or almost 4 million cups of tea.
When the Romans came to Britain, they were amazed by this incredible phenomenon. The only explanation was that this was a sacred site and the mark of the gods.
So the Romans set to work. They built a vast complex here around 70 AD. This was made of 2 parts. Firstly, the temple around the sacred spring, and secondly, the baths with their healing waters used for relaxing, cleaning, and socializing.
In Roman times, this settlement was named Aquae Sulis, which meant the waters of Sulis. Sulis was a local Celtic deity, a goddess of healing and sacred waters. But the Romans mixed this local deity with one of their own, Minerva, the goddess of wisdom. So the temple here, with the sacred spring, became the Temple of Sulis Minerva.
The first known reference to the springs and temple at Bath is from the Roman writer Solinus in the 3rd century AD. He wrote, "In Britain are many great rivers and warm springs adorned with such a splendour for the use of mortals. Minerva is the patron goddess of these, and in her temple the eternal flame never whitens to ash, but rather, when the fire dies away, it turns into rocky, round masses." The temple here, which was built in the 1st century AD, was pretty grand. It stood in the centre of a courtyard, and this walkway is suspended above what was once the temple courtyard and where worshippers could gather to pray to the goddess Sulis Minerva. And it was pretty grisly stuff. This is the sacrificial altar where animals, perhaps a pig, a sheep or an ox, were slaughtered.
The intestines of the animal were then examined by a priest called a haruspex, a word which means entrail observer in Latin. The stone here was dedicated to the haruspex at Aquae Sulis, a chap named Lucius Marcus Memor.
This inscription was originally carved to be symmetrical, with HAR in the centre to stand for haruspex. But because the haruspex was so rare, in fact, Memor was the only haruspex we know of in Britain, no one had any idea what these 3 letters meant. And so there's a later addition on the right of SP to clarify the meaning and completely ruin the symmetry.
The temple's facade was made of 4 fluted columns, and this, the temple pediment, which would have been brightly painted. It has a formidable Gorgon's head gazing down from a height of 15 metres to all who approach the temple.
Of course, those Romans never got to see it up close and personal like we are now, but from this vantage point you'll discover it's full of all sorts of quirky characters. The central head is held up by female victories on a shield ringed with oak leaves. The victories stand on globes, and the great head itself has snakes entwined in its beard, wings above its ears, furrowed brow, and a heavy moustache.
Down here is a helmet in the form of a dolphin's head, and here is a small owl tucked away to the lower right of the large central roundel, probably perching at the top of another helmet.
So, what does it all mean? Well, perhaps this is the head of the Gorgon, the mythical creature killed by the Greek hero Perseus with the assistance of the goddess Athena. Now, this would make sense, as the Roman goddess Minerva was the same deity as the Greek goddess Athena and with the same powers and attributes. But a problem with this interpretation is that the Gorgon was female, and this chap here with his big moustache is most definitely not. So perhaps it was a combination of the local Celtic and classical Roman imagery.
Another idea is that this is a water god, as it's quite similar to the other water gods from Britain at the time.
Some interesting theories, but all I can think of is that massive stone statue in the Chamber of Secrets in the second Harry Potter film. I suppose there's only one way to find out. Parseltongue. Let me see if I can remember any. I think he's a Gryffindor.
Inside the temple was a gilt bronze statue of the goddess Sulis Minerva, shimmering in a room lit only by flickering flames. Incredibly, the head of the statue still survives. The head had 6 layers of gilding. The first 2 use a technique known as fire gilding, whilst the 4 later layers are applied as gold leaf. You can see that there's a bit of corrosion in parts, and this comes from lying in the ground for over 1,000 years, for this was only rediscovered in 1727.
But I love this detail below the chin. Look at this strange rectangular cut. They think this is a mistake in the original casting process when a bubble on the surface may have been cut out and filled with an inserted plate. Now, it's quite a big mistake for that craftsman, considering this is the most important statue in one of the most sacred temples in Britain. Anyway, he managed to patch it up at the time by gilding over it. But of course, over time, the plate has fallen out, meaning that all these centuries later, the 1.3 million visitors who pour through these doors each year can have a really good look at his botched handiwork.
I was lucky enough to meet Zosha, who works in the museum stores, where I got a bit of a closer look at some of these incredible objects.
So, Joshua, it's so exciting to be down here in the stone stores. What are we looking at today?
So we're going to have a little look at some of the objects that are on display, but in person.
Okay.
To start off with, a couple of curse tablets.
So what is a curse tablet?
So curse tablets were thrown into the spring by the Romans,
Okay.
and it is essentially a piece of lead that's either rolled out or squished out, and you write into it with a metal stylus your message to the goddess. So,
and what kind of messages were those?
mostly angry. So these are quite personal a lot of the time, and they're usually quite petty. And they're about things like having your cloak stolen. There's people having money stolen. It's little thefts and things like that. I just love the idea of someone coming to the baths, having the cloak stolen, and then immediately going to the temple and writing an angry curse to the goddess and saying, so-and-so stole my cloak, and throwing it into the water. Yeah, in revenge.
That's great. And so people where would they find these little bits of lead? Are they something that was that something that would have just been lying around everywhere, or?
No, so the lead's actually sourced from the Mendips, which are the hills sort of just beyond Bath. And it's the same lead that the Romans used for plumbing on site as well. So there's a lot of lead working going on in terms of the building anyway, but it's likely they were making these nearby or even on the temple precinct.
Okay, great. Well, what's this one say then?
So I've talked about the ones that have stories, and there's all sorts of really exciting ones, but a lot of the ones that we have that aren't currently on display are ones like this. So this is a small sheet of lead, and you can see scratched into the surface there 2 names.
So can you make out? B.
Yep,
Brit.
B-R-I-T. So this is Britty Vendor, which is a lady's name.
Oh, right.
And there's another one underneath it that begins with a V. And the 2 names are probably because the person didn't necessarily know who had done the bad thing. So they haven't written the message out to the goddess. They haven't said what it is, and they're not really sure who it is. So
They're just hedging their bets.
Yeah,
It's got to be one of these guys.
Minerva will sort it out. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. Yeah.
How amazing.
Yeah. But I like the mystery of these ones that are just the names, because
Yeah.
actually, with some of them, is it everyone on the list? Have you just got a hit list, you
Yeah.
know? Or is it just Minerva's going to work out what to do with these
Sure.
people and who it is who's done
It's
the
really
thing.
interesting.
Yeah.
Brilliant.
I did bring you out because we're on a theme of lead, another object.
I love lead. A lot of lead today.
And this is the other aspect of lead on site, which is the fact that they use it for all the plumbing. Do you know the cool lead plumbing fact, which is the...
No, tell me.
It comes, I know, cool fact. It comes from, the word plumbing comes from the Roman word for lead, which is plumbum.
Oh, right, okay.
So it's come from them in the first place.
What is
And
it,
then plumbum.
Plumbum.
Yeah.
It's the word for lead.
Yeah.
Okay, everyone, take that home.
And it's still PB in the periodic table of elements.
Oh, yeah,
For
of
that
course.
as well. Yeah, and it's great. So you get plumber and everything from the Romans. And kids absolutely love it every time you just say the word plumbum.
Yeah, plumbum. Wow, that's incredible. And so how come this has come off
So there are some bits that have come off and some bits are still
So
on?
this, you can see there's a big chop there. It's actually been deliberately cut from the bottom of the bath, and we don't really know exactly when or why or by who, but Major Davis, who did most of the excavations of the Great Bath, was known to have sold some lead, so it's entirely possible that this was one of the pieces that was cut out by him.
I hear there's a stone store to look around.
Yes, I think we should go and have a look.
Okay, thanks so much, Sasha.
Brilliant, no worries.
Wow, look at this.
Yeah, so we've got a few shelves of Roman objects here that I wanted to show you. So we're going to start off with this piece here. So this is something called a finial.
Okay.
So a finial is like a decorative knobble that sits on top of a roof, and we've got a few of these from the bathhouse itself. So you had the big vaulted roof, and then right at the very top you had three of these kind of decorative ones.
This is the roof decor.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is the shape that would have fit onto that top of your roof, and then this is the actual top of it, so it's lying on its side. Now you can see it's lived a bit of a hard life, so it's quite worn and weathered, and this is because it's bath stone, which is our local stone. Almost all of the stone we see from site is bath stone. It's limestone, and it's quite porous, so when you get heavy rain or chemicals, especially sort of acid rain these days, it gets really damaged. So this has lived a very long and hard life on top of the roof of the Great Bath, probably.
Wow, super.
Then we've got a couple of other pieces as well. So we've got lots of odds and ends of inscriptions from the site, but there's also some nice bits of carving. So a lot of the full carved pieces don't survive because when the Roman baths are torn down, it collapses and we get a lot of things that break. And one of the classic objects that you see on Roman sites that's sort of to do with, working for food and things like that is a quernstone, so like a big round grinding stone. So these that you've got here, there's a hole in the middle, you grind one on top of the other, grind your grain to make flours and things like that. And there's lots of broken pieces, but my favourite is this one here. So if I just give you this piece to hold, so that's the curve going on the outside here, you'd have had this big circle like that. And this is the other broken part of it here. And you can see it fits together like this.
Oh yeah.
And this blob in the middle that's would have been holding it together, this is actually a piece of lead, and it's a Roman bit of lead that has been stuck in because it would have broken in the Roman period, and someone loved this quernstone so much that they stuck it back together so that they could still use it.
Oh, a bit of DIY repairs then.
DIY repairs. And I think because you can feel it's quite crusty, crunchy stone, you get quernstones made out of sort of volcanic material, so it's probably imported, and it would have been really special to someone. So they would have wanted to keep using it even when it did break.
Yeah, because presumably they couldn't have used the local bath stone for that
No,
kind of thing.
you definitely could have. You'd really struggled. You'd have ended up with extremely gritty bread. Dusty bread.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a sculpture from the tomb of a wealthy Roman lady. Her hairstyle is incredibly elaborate and the height of fashion for hair in the 1st century AD. At the back, the hair is divided into thin plaits and then coiled into a heavy bun. And at the front, she has this diadem of tiny curls framing the face. She must have been pretty wealthy, as it would be impossible to do this on your own. So she must have had slaves to do it for her. This tombstone is really fascinating. It translates as Julius Vitalis, armourer of the 20th Legion, Valeria Victrix, a 9-year service, aged 29 years. A Belgic tribesman with funeral paid for by the Guild of Armourers lies here. Now, Vitalis came from a tribe called the Belgae, who lived in southern Britain as well as northern France. He died here in Aquae Sulis in the later 1st century AD, and so may have been with the troops who built the baths and temple. He was one of the many skilled craftsmen with the army who maintained and repaired equipment.
So that's the temple, but what about the baths? And how did those Romans turn a few muddy springs into this civilized, chic spa?
First of all, a reservoir was created around the natural spring. Then it was surrounded by a lead-lined wall that formed a watertight tank, and after this they built sophisticated drainage systems to stop the silt building up and allowing the water to flow through the baths. This is the Great Bath. This massive pool was lined with 45 sheets of lead, probably from the Mendip Hills, and filled with hot spa water. The bath is 1.6 metres deep, which was ideal for bathing, and it has steps leading down on all the sides. Niches around the baths would have held benches for bathers and possibly small tables for drinks and snacks.
This large flat slab of stone set across the point where hot water flows into the bath is known today as the diving stone.
Now, everything above ground level here was actually built much later than the Romans, so you do have to use your imagination a bit. What the Romans built was actually much grander, and for many Roman visitors, this may have been the largest building they had ever entered in their life. It was covered with an enormous barrel vaulted ceiling, 20 metres high, and here it is, the original roof, this great mass of tiles and lime mortar. These are the bases of the original columns which once held up the roof. This really was a marvel of engineering. Look at these channels on the ground surface. This is where they sent hot water to keep the baths warm and hot air to create underfloor heating.
It looks pretty serene today, but we can imagine that these were noisy places. The great philosopher and statesman Seneca described what it was like living above a bathhouse in around 50 AD.
I live over a public bathhouse, he began. Just imagine every kind of annoying noise. The sturdy gentleman does his exercise with lead weights when he is working hard or pretending to. I can hear him grunt when he breathes out. I can hear him panting in high-pitched tones. Or I might notice some lazy fellow content with the cheap rub-down and hear the blows of the hands slapping his shoulders. The sound varies depending on the massager hits with a flat or hollow hand. To all of this, you can add the arrest of the occasional pickpocket. There's also the racket made by the man who loves to hear his own voice in the bath, or the chap who dives in with a lot of noise and splashing.
The rest of the baths contained changing rooms, saunas and pools. A visitor could use the cold bath, the frigidarium, a warm bath, the tepidarium, and a hot bath, the caldarium. Some of the baths also contained an exercise area, the palaestra, and a gymnasium too.
This is the frigidarium. This is a cold circular plunge pool, 1.5 metres deep. And it seems like there are still some Romans enjoying it.
It was too expensive for most Romans to have their own spa at home, as Roman houses had a water supply via lead pipes, and these pipes were taxed according to their size.
Petronius, who was a Roman courtier during the reign of Nero, described a trip to his local baths. "We undressed quickly," he said, "and went into the hot baths, and after working up a sweat, passed on to the cold bath. Then he came across his friend, whose skin was glistening all over with perfumed oil. He was rubbed down with not ordinary linen, but with cloths of the purest and softest wool. He was then wrapped in a blazing scarlet robe, hoisted into a litter, and trundled off."
Here we can see how the Romans managed to do underfloor heating. This is an example of the hypercourse system. The word hypercourse comes from the Greek words hypo, which means under, and coursed, which means burnt.
Hot air from a wood-burning furnace outside the building would have been drawn under the floor and flowed between these pillars of tiles and concrete, known as pili. There were also tiled or clay flues under the walls, which circulated the hot air to the room's walls and floors above.
It was an incredibly efficient system and years before its time. After the fall of the Western Roman Empire, we didn't have central heating like it until the 20th century.
And this is the spring overflow. This is where all the water leaves the site, flowing down a great drain, the original Roman drain, and on to the River Avon, 400 metres beyond. And I have to say, it's pretty steamy in here.
The site here remained a focal point for worship until the 4th century AD, when the Romans left, and as Christianity gathered strength, the old pagan religion was marginalised, and in 391 AD, the Emperor Theodosius ordered the closure of pagan temples, such as this one throughout the empire. So according to the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, within a century after the Romans left, the baths here were in ruins.
Over the years, the Roman site fell out of use. The ruins were built upon, and it seemed that the Roman history was lost in the mists of time. Of course, the people here continued to bathe in the waters. When the Welsh monk Nennius visited in the 9th century, he recorded what he saw. Surrounded by a wall and made of brick and stone, men go there to bathe at any time. And every man has the kind of bath he likes. If he wants, it will be a cold bath. If he wants a hot bath, it will be hot.
The 16th century traveller John Leyland visited the town and reported, "The city of Bath is set both in a fruitful and pleasant bottom, the which is environed on every side with great hills, out of the which come many springs of pure water that be conveyed by diverse ways to serve the city."
By the Georgian period, the city became a hub of fashionable society, and the creme de la creme absolutely loved the baths here. But with all the tourists flocking in, there was some concern about the cleanliness of these baths. Samuel Johnson wrote, "Methinks it cannot be clean to go so many bodies together in the same water." In fact, the water did actually stain people's clothes a yellowish colour, and you can see the marks left by the water here in the King's Bath. To counteract this, people began to wear these colours to disguise the stain. The great travel writer Celia Fiennes explained that ladies go into the baths with garments made of a fine yellow canvas. The gentlemen have drawers and waistcoats of the same sort.
And the behaviour here was far from civilised, according to Oliver Goldsmith, who found the city mean and contemptible, and said the amusements of this place were neither elegant nor conducted with delicacy. Tobias Smollett, who visited the spa city and published an essay on the external use of water in 1752, reported, "A national hospital it may be, but one would imagine that none but lunatics are admitted."
It was during the 18th century that people became especially enamoured with the idea of drinking the spa water too, with its 43 minerals including sodium, calcium, magnesium, silica and iron. In 1707, the pump room was built, a striking neoclassical salon where the hot spa water was drawn for drinking for the fashionable elite of Bath. Dr. William Oliver had complete faith in the remedial power of these waters, writing in 1707, "If patients can't be cured by drinking or bathing here, they will never be cured anywhere." In 1891, another man warned that bath waters were so powerful in their actions that a course of treatment by them must be entered upon with caution and not without a certain amount of responsibility.
In Charles Dickens's book, The Pickwick Papers, the character Sam Weller describes the taste as particularly unpleasant and a very strong flavour of warm, flat irons.
I feel better already. But everything was to change in 1878. The city's surveyor and architect, Major Charles Davis, discovered a leak in the baths. Whilst investigating the source of the problem, he came across something quite extraordinary: Roman tiles, lead and pottery.
It was the start of the excavation of the original Roman site, and as soon as the city realised these incredible Roman treasures had lay beneath their feet for all these years, they began purchasing the buildings which stood here and demolishing them so it could be excavated.
By 1883, the site was ready and the doors were flung open to welcome the eager punters. It was incredibly popular, visited by 100,000 people in 1890 alone. They would bathe in the hot waters, sweat in the steam baths and even have the water pumped or sprayed over their bodies. The water was mixed with mud packs and they even practiced electrotherapy.
And those Victorians made a few tweaks and additions too to really lay into the Roman vibe, including lining this terrace with statues of Roman emperors and governors of Britain.
They were supposed to install a roof here, but there wasn't enough money to do so, and so it was more of an alfresco experience. But perhaps they didn't realise that this would turn the water this vivid green colour, for it's the exposure to the sunlight which encourages the algae to grow.
The baths were open to the public and used to provide water cure treatments on prescription through the NHS from 1948 until 1976.
However, since 1978, they were closed to the public after a girl who swam in the waters died of a meningitis-related illness. After this, the water was found to be polluted by a dangerous amoeba linked to meningitis.
So you definitely wouldn't want to swim in it today. But it's still enjoyed by the public as a museum, with over 1.3 million visitors each year.
So there you have it, the Roman baths in a nutshell. Thanks so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, click subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you next time. Nestled in the heart of London, not far from St Paul's Cathedral, is an area known as Temple. It's a maze of cobbled paths, narrow arches and quirky courtyards. It's so distinctly quiet compared to the bustle of Fleet Street that Charles Dickens observed, "Who enters here leaves noise behind."
And it's lucky it's so quiet, for this is London's legal quarter, and behind these elegant facades are some of the biggest brains in the country. There are barristers poring over texts, scribbling down notes, and making jokes about Latin declensions. There are 2 of the 4 of London's Inns of Courts here, the Middle Temple and the Inner Temple.
It might be an oasis of hushed tones today, but it wasn't always quite so tranquil. Geoffrey Chaucer, who mentioned one of the clerks of the Inner Temple in the prologue of Canterbury Tales, was probably a student here, and he was recorded for fighting with a Franciscan friar in Fleet Street. And in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, the mob poured through these lanes into the houses of the temple lawyers. They carried off everything they could find, valuable books, deeds and rolls of remembrance, and burnt them to cinders. But in the centre of this maze is a building far older and far more intriguing than the antics of Geoffrey Chaucer or Wat Tyler's revolting peasants. Here is a building drenched in almost 9 centuries of turbulent history, of crusading knights, secret pacts, hidden cells, and blazing firestorms. This is a history so enthralling it provided the inspiration for Dan Brown's Da Vinci Code. Today, I'll take you behind its closed doors. These are the secrets of Temple Church.
In 1118, a holy order of crusading knights was formed. They took the traditional vows of poverty, chastity and obedience, as well as a 4th vow, to protect pilgrims in the Holy Land as they travelled to and from Jerusalem.
These knights were given headquarters in Jerusalem near Temple Mount, believed to be the Temple of Solomon, and so they became known as the Fellow Soldiers of Christ and of the Temple of Solomon in Jerusalem, or Templars for short.
In 1162, these Templar Knights built this round church as their base in London, and the area became known as Temple. Over the years, they became incredibly powerful, working as bankers and diplomatic brokers to kings. So this area of Temple grew to become the centre of England's religious, political and economic life.
Here on the west door are some clues to the church's crusading past. Each of these columns are surmounted by 4 busts. These ones on the north side are wearing caps or turbans, whereas those on the south side are bareheaded. And once more, if you look really closely, some of them wear tight-fitting, buttoned clothing. Before the 14th century, buttons were considered to be oriental, and so some of the figures here may represent the Muslims who the Templars were called upon to fight.
When you come into the church today, you'll notice the 2 parts, the chancel and the round.
This circular design was inspired by the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, which they believed to be the site of Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection.
So the Templars commissioned a circular design for their London church too, which was lucky. As it turns out, it has a wonderful acoustic for singing.
In the Middle Ages, this would have looked quite different. There were brightly painted lozenge shapes on the walls. The carved heads were bursting with colour. Metallic plating was on the ceiling to reflect the candlelight, and there were even banners hanging down from the columns.
And although most of this doesn't survive, there are still some hints to a bygone medieval past. On the ground are 9 male figures, weathered and bashed by the ravages of time, and packed full of symbolism and hidden meaning. They are all depicted in their early 30s, the age at which Christ died.
Now, you might be thinking that these knights look quite relaxed lying down, some of them with their legs crossed as if they're lazing around on the beach. Well, actually, these crossed legs come from the way that people were depicted in manuscripts and stained glass at the time.
It was meant to show action, to show the knight walking towards the viewer with one leg in front of the other, although I'm not quite sure how well that sense of action translates to these effigies. Another theory is that the crossed legs are a symbol of those who had gone on crusades.
Let me introduce you to the most important of our effigies, a man known as the best knight that ever lived. This is William Marshal, the first Earl of Pembroke.
He was a soldier and statesman who served 4 English kings, and perhaps most famously, he was one of the chief mediators in the years leading up to the Magna Carta.
Actually, in the countdown to Runnymede, lots of the negotiations around Magna Carta happened here in Temple Church, and some of them were quite dramatic. In January 1215, when the king was in the temple, in charged a group of barons armed and ready to fight. They confronted the king and demanded his submission to a charter.
William Marshal was in the centre of all of this, and in 1219 he was buried here in the Round. When they excavated under this floor in 1842, they found rows of medieval coffins and the enormous bones of the tall, handsome William Marshal. Beside the effigy of William Marshal, the first Earl, is his son, William Marshal, the second Earl.
And don't forget that these sculptures would have been blazing with coloured paint. Analysis from the 1840s tells us that there would have once been a delicate flesh colour on the face. The mouldings had some light green, there were traces of gilding on the ringnail, and the buckles, spurs and even this little squirrel hiding underneath the shield had been gilt. The surcoat, that's the tunic worn over the armour, was coloured in crimson, and the inner lining was light blue.
And below them is the mailed effigy of Gilbert Marshal, the third son of the famous William Marshal. He is in a chain hood, drawing a sword with his left foot resting on a winged dragon.
Gilbert's life was tragically cut short. He was just setting off for crusades when he was killed by a fall from his horse in a tournament. Like all the four sons of William Marshal, he died without issue and the family line came to an abrupt end. The rumours soon began to spread that the Earl of Pembroke had been cursed.
The Knights Templars' management of the routes in and out of the Middle East soon brought them great wealth, with which came great power, with which came great enemies. Rumours, started by rivals in other religious orders and the nobility, began to spread of their nefarious conduct, sacrilegious initiation ceremonies, and worship of idols.
Now, one particularly notorious story was in regards to Walter Bachelor, who refused to follow the order's rules. He was locked away for 8 weeks and starved to death, and in a final insult, he was even refused a proper burial.
Behind this door is a space 4.5 feet long and 2 feet 9 inches wide. The story goes, this is the penitentiary cell where Walter Bachelor spent his final miserable days.
It was just one of the terrible rumours which blackened the name of the Templars. And in 1307, at the instigation of Philip IV, the King of France, who also happened to owe them quite a lot of money, the order was abolished by the Pope. King Edward II took control of this church and gave it to the Order of St. John.
The following centuries were full of drama, including the great theological debate in the 1580s, known as the Battle of the Pulpits. The church was rented out to a bunch of lawyers, the Inner Temple and Middle Temple, who shared the use of the church and still do to this day. It was during these years that Richard Martin was around.
Now, I know at first glance this might appear to be a sombre, sober, rule-abiding lawyer, but I'm afraid that's not quite the truth. Richard Martin was described as a very handsome man, a graceful speaker, facetious and well-loved. And once more, he made it his business to organise riotous parties for Middle Temple lawyers. He was so notorious for this debauchery, it took him 15 years to qualify as a barrister. Time well spent, I'd say.
There have been all sorts of refurbishments here too, and although the church miraculously survived the Great Fire of London in 1666, Christopher Wren still added a few classical features. Then there were more alterations in a medieval style during the Gothic revival of the Victorian period. Now, not much of the Victorian work is visible, apart from up here in the clerestory.
Lots of people never notice this because it's hidden away up here in the gallery, but this is a remarkable display of encaustic tiles. Now, encaustic tiles were originally produced by the Cistercian monks in the 12th century and were found in abbeys, monasteries and royal palaces all across Britain during the medieval period.
They went out of fashion abruptly in the 1540s during the Reformation, but were rescued by the Victorians who fell in love with all things medieval. So, as the Palace of Westminster was being rebuilt in all its Gothic splendour, Temple Church was being decked out in encaustic tiles.
So these were all created by the Victorians, and the design here is very simple and striking. They have a solid red body inlaid with white and glazed with yellow, and some of them feature a knight on horseback, just like the medieval originals from Temple Church. And if you look really closely and perhaps even run your hands over the surface, you'll notice they even have a pitted surface made to imitate that of a medieval tile. It's a subtle, romantic nod to the bygone days of the Knights Templar.
The most testing moment of the church's history came during the night of the 10th of May 1941. This was the most devastating raid of the Blitz. German bombers sent down 711 tons of explosives, and around 1,400 people were killed, over 2,000 injured, and 14 hospitals damaged. There were fires the whole length of London, and by morning 700 acres of the city were destroyed, about double that of the Great Fire of London.
Temple Church was at the heart of these attacks. Around midnight, fire watchers saw an incendiary land on this roof. The fire caught hold and spread down to the body of the church itself.
The blaze was so fierce, it split the chancel's columns, melted the lead, and the wooden roof of the round caved in on the knights' effigies below.
At 2 o'clock in the morning, remembered the senior warden, it was as light as day. Charred papers and embers were flying through the air. Bombs and shrapnel were all around. It was an awe-inspiring sight.
The fire brigade were powerless to stop the blaze. The attack had been timed so that the Thames was at low tide, making it impossible to use the water. Temple Church was lucky not to have been completely annihilated. The destruction was immense, although not totally unwelcome for some of those who considered the Victorian restoration work as outright vandalism.
For my own part, wrote the treasurer of the Inner Temple, seeing how dreadfully the church had been despoiled by its pretended friends a century before, I do not grieve so very acutely for the havoc now wrought by its avowed enemies. To have got rid of their awful stained glass windows, their ghastly pulpit, their hideous encaustic tiles, their abominable pews and seats, on which they alone spent over £10,000, will be almost a blessing in disguise.
It was 17 years before the church was fully repaired, and fully repaired it was indeed.
The cracked columns were all replaced with new stone from the beds of Purbeck marble, quarried in the Middle Ages. And if you look really carefully, you'll notice they aren't quite straight. Well, the original columns had been famous for tilting outwards, and so they rebuilt them at the same wonky angle. And I would say this is 2.1 degrees off, perhaps? Certainly not plumb.
The organ too is a post-war addition, since the original was destroyed in the Blitz. This organ began its life in the wild hills of Aberdeenshire. It was built in 1927 for the ballroom of the Glentana House, where its inaugural reception had been given by the great composer Marcel Dupré.
But the acoustic in that Scottish ballroom, which is quite a squat space covered in hundreds of antlers, was described as dead as it well could be, and very disappointing. And so this organ wasn't used much. And so Lord Glentana gifted the organ to the church, and it came whizzing down to London by rail in 1953.
Since then, Lord Glentana's organ has greatly impressed many a musician, including none other than the film composer Hans Zimmer, who described this as one of the most magnificent organs in the world. After spending 2 years writing the score for Interstellar, Zimmer chose this organ to record the film score, performed by the organist here, Roger Sayer.
Once more, the sound and tonal potential of this organ was so remarkable that the score for Interstellar was actually shaped and created around the possibilities of this incredible instrument. Well done, organ. I hope they gave you a credit.
And you can piece together the story of Temple Church from the clues in this stained glass window.
At the bottom we have the story of the medieval knights. Here is a grant of money being made to the Knights Templar, and on the other side we have 2 knights on horses. Then 3 figures which symbolise the vows of the Templars. The Knight Templars standing at vigil for obedience. There's the veiled nobleman in the centre representing chastity, and on the right is St. Francis blessing the birds for poverty.
Then there's scenes of the Temple Church as it was before the war, when it had a pointed roof. And then the fires from the Blitz raging around St. Paul's Cathedral. We have the cross of the Templars and the cross of Jerusalem, and then the biblical figures Solomon, Ezekiel, David, and at the very centre at the top, Christ himself.
So there it is, the story of Temple Church. It's a history peppered with thrills, terror, and even riotous parties. So perhaps it's no surprise that this was also the inspiration for one of William Shakespeare's most famous scenes. I've got just one more delight to show you, just a stone's throw away.
This is the inner temple garden. It might look like a pleasant place to have lunch in the centre of the city, but this is one of the most important locations in literature, for this is the setting of one of Shakespeare's most famous scenes. It was here in Temple Garden where Shakespeare's characters declared their loyalties to the York and Lancastrian factions by plucking a red rose or a white rose, and thus beginning the epic drama, The Wars of the Roses.
So here we have it, King Henry VI, Part 1, Act 2, Scene 4. And these are Shakespeare's words set in the Temple Garden, although this is slightly an abridged version. It begins, "Great lords and ladies, what means this silence? Dare no man answer in the case of truth? Let him that is a true-born gentleman and stands upon the honour of his birth, if he suppose that I have pleaded truth, from off this briar pluck a white rose with me. Let him that is no coward, nor no flatterer, but dare maintain the party of the truth, pluck a red rose from this thorn with me." This brawl today, grown to this faction in the Temple Garden, shall send, between the red rose and the white, 1,000 souls to death and deadly night.
Hope you enjoyed the video. For more tours like this one and much more besides, please subscribe to the History Hit YouTube channel.
Today I'm exploring one of Britain's most extraordinary medieval buildings on the outskirts of Winchester. It is the Hospital of St Cross and Almshouse of Noble Poverty. This is a site which has operated since the 12th century, so it's absolutely packed with history from all ages. We're going to be looking at everything from medieval graffiti to ward off evil spirits to a changing room used by King Philip of Spain, and it's all being brought exclusively to you on the History Hit YouTube channel. So without further ado, these are the secrets of the Hospital of St Cross. Our story begins during some of England's darkest days in the middle of the 12th century, as the two rival contenders, Stephen and Matilda, fought to assert their claim to the throne. The country was plunged into civil war, and with it came a widespread breakdown in law and order. It was a time which became known as the Anarchy.
Around this time, one nobleman called Henry of Blois, who was the brother of Stephen, the claimant to the throne, was walking here alongside the River Itchen, just outside the city of Winchester. Legend has it that as he was walking, he was stopped by a young peasant girl.
She begged Henry to help her people who were starving, and the parallel of this young girl with the Virgin Mary was not lost on Henry.
He was greatly moved by her plight, and a little further along the river, when he came across the ruins of an old religious house which had been destroyed by the Danes, he made a promise there and then. He vowed to build a foundation to help the poor and needy.
Whether or not this legend is wholly true, we will never be sure, but we do know about Henry of Blois, and we know that he was very young, very wealthy, and very powerful. Some might say he was quite a catch.
He was appointed Bishop of Winchester in 1129 at the age of 28, and he did indeed establish a charitable institution here between 1132 and 1136. It was known as the Hospital of St Cross, and it is said to be England's oldest charitable institution still in use.
The hospital was a hospital in the older sense of the word, meaning a charitable institution, not a medical facility. It was to provide lodgings and food for 13 poor men, so frail that they were unable to work. It's thought that they chose 13 to represent Christ and his 12 disciples.
The Charter of Foundation read, 13 men, feeble and so reduced in strength that they can scarcely or not at all support themselves without other aid, shall remain in the same hospital constantly. And besides those 13 poor men, 100 other poor persons, as deserving as can be found, shall be received at the hour of dinner. And so the hospital also served as a way station for pilgrims on their way to Canterbury. Anyone who requested it at the porter's gate was entitled to a wayfarer's dole.
The custom originated with a monk from Cluny in France who came across to Winchester and worked here. It was the norm in Cluny to give bread and wine to travellers, and in turn the Hospital of St Cross adopted the idea and anglicised it. So instead of a taster of French wine, you were given English beer, and the tradition continues to this very day. Cheers!
Delicious. The buildings within these walls are where the Brethren lived, and still do to this very day. The 13 men became known as the Brothers of St Cross. Then, as now, they were not monks. St Cross is not a monastery, but a secular foundation with a church attached. In the medieval period, it was endowed with land, mills and farms, providing food and drink to support the poor at the gates.
The official name of this place is the Hospital of St Cross and the Almshouse of Noble Poverty, and that's because there are actually two ancient charitable foundations here, which have merged over time. The brothers from the two foundations are named the Black Brothers and the Red Brothers. So first there was the Hospital of St Cross, which was founded right at the start in 1132 by Henry of Blois. Now, brothers from this foundation are called the Black Brothers, for they wear a black robe, a black trencher hat and a silver badge in the shape of the Cross of Jerusalem.
But later on, in 1445, Cardinal Henry Beaufort became Bishop of Winchester. He was the son of John of Gaunt and his mistress, Catherine Swynford, which made him the half-brother of King Henry IV, and he became most well known for his involvement in the trial of Joan of Arc.
For many years, Beaufort had a reputation as an ambitious and unscrupulous statesman. In fact, Shakespeare summed it up by describing his whole time on earth as a monstrous life.
But it seems Beaufort may have softened in old age, for when he was Bishop of Winchester, he founded the Brethren of the Order of Noble Poverty. These were the Brothers Red, and they wear deep red gowns and hats and a silver cardinal's badge.
This was for noblemen who had fallen on hard times. Perhaps their castle roof had fallen in, or they could no longer afford to line their velvet cloak with ermine. Noble poverty indeed.
You can see Cardinal Beaufort outside the Porter's Lodge as this weathered statue. In fact, this 3-storey tower is Beaufort Tower, built around 1450.
One of the most exciting things about the hospital is that it's absolutely covered in ancient graffiti. Not far from Beaufort Tower on this entrance gateway are some intersecting compass-drawn circles. This is thought to be an astronomical drawing showing the movement of the planets, with each of the circles representing their journeys. We think it represents a Copernican diagram with the sun at the centre rather than earlier medieval diagrams which showed the Earth at the centre. But who drew it or why it's here remains a mystery.
Today, graffiti is seen as pretty antisocial and not something the church would encourage. But it wasn't always like that. During the Middle Ages, graffiti appears to have been acceptable as people carved it out to seek protection from evil. So, as you'll discover, the Hospital of St Cross is covered with inscriptions and carvings. These are the almshouses where the brothers live today. These were built by Cardinal Beaufort in the 15th century. There's space for 25 brothers in total, each of whom is given his own flat, so you're either on the ground floor or the first floor. Each of the flats has a sitting room, a bedroom, a kitchen, a bathroom, and, most importantly, a separate loo.
So, who gets to live here? Well, the rules are pretty strict. Brothers must be male, they must be single, widowed or divorced, and over 60 years of age. And preference is given to those most in need. They have to go to daily morning prayers, and during that they have to wear their robes. So, none of these silly pink dresses. Time for lunch.
This is the Brethren's Hall, which was built in the 14th century. It had to be big enough to feed the brethren and 100 poor men.
At this end, it's got this timber screen with a gallery above, from which are hanging these wonderful Elizabethan fire buckets, and it leads you up to a splendid arch-braced timber roof. In the centre is the central hearth, and then a dais. Up here is when the master dined with the brethren, and then this wooden staircase led to the master's room, so he could make a grand arrival or crawl back up to his rooms, perhaps.
And look at this pelican. This was installed because it was the arms of Bishop Fox, who was the master here in the 15th century.
A pelican was a common symbol of selflessness, as it was said a pelican mother would make the ultimate sacrifice by tearing her own flesh from her chest to feed her offspring. Up here we've got the coat of arms of Cardinal Beaufort, but what you'll notice is it's got a blue and white checkered border, and this indicated that he was born out of wedlock. And it's this practice, this symbolism, that gives us the phrase, a checkered past. Each of the brothers was required to make their own chair using bodging, a traditional wood-turning craft which used green, unseasoned wood. And this one's even chiselled out a little message, in usum senioris fratris, it reads in Latin, for the use of an older brother.
These were the kitchens, and it must have been a pretty busy place because there was a lot of food to prepare.
On feast days during the Restoration period, it was recorded that brethren have a sirloin of beef roasted, weighing 46 pounds and a half, and 3 large mince pies, and plum broth, and 3 joints of mutton for their supper, and 6 quarts and 1 pint of beer extraordinary at dinner, and 6 quarts and 1 pint of beer after dinner by the fireside, 6 quarts and a pint at supper, and the like after supper. And on Wednesdays, before Shrove Tuesdays, at dinner, every brother hath a pancake.
And this is the most important room of the whole site. This is the cellar where they stored all the beer.
The water here was unfit for drinking, so they had no choice but to drink copious amounts of beer and ale.
See, the Middle Ages wasn't all bad. But in the centre of it all is the oldest and most magnificent part of the site, the church, which is more like a Norman cathedral in miniature. It's certainly a lot bigger than the typical almshouse chapel, and as the walls are over 1 metre thick, they used a lot of materials. Local flint was combined with stone brought in from Caen in France, Dorset and the Isle of Wight.
And look at this, the mark of hundreds of years of brethren's footsteps.
They kicked off the building works in 1135, which you can see in this chancel.
This is typically Norman with rounded arches and windows and all of these wonderful zigzags. They call this a chevron design. But as they continued building the church, the architectural fashions and styles changed. So you'll notice at this end of the church, which was built later, it's in a Gothic style with pointed arches. So art historians call this a transitional Norman church.
The reason that medieval cathedrals made the jump from rounded to pointed arches was because the pointed shape was stronger. It could hold more weight. So instead of having really thick walls of solid stone with tiny windows, the pointed arches could provide the structural support, leaving the rest of the wall to be thinner or even as a stained glass window.
When they were building this church, they did something really quite clever. On this pillar is a cross, and this stone surround is precisely angled so that on 2 days of the year, the sun streams through the windows and falls directly on it. Those 2 days are the 3rd of May, the day of the church calendar for the invention of the cross, and the 14th of September, the Holy Cross Day. These are so-called daisy wheels or hexafoils. They're compass draw motifs, some of which have these 6 petal shapes inside. They were made as protection against evil spirits and the devil, and are often found around doors or windows to stop evil entering a building.
For many churches such as this, the 16th century was a turbulent time. Many were destroyed or damaged in the dissolution of the monasteries, a result of Henry VIII's split with the Catholic Church in Rome.
Luckily, the church survived the Reformation period pretty much unscathed, but there was a bit of a shake-up with the rules. It seemed that people had been taking advantage of all the charitable freebies given out, and it was time to call it to an end. In no case shall such alms be afforded, it was declared, to strong, robust and indolent mendicants, like so many that wander about such places, those useless burdens upon the earth, who ought rather to be driven away with staves.
Once more, any remnants of papacy were thrown to the dogs. The Apostles' Creed was to be read in English, and it was stated, "The master or president shall not exhibit relics, images, or miracles." In the choir area is this 16th century wooden prayer desk, which is covered in graffiti. Some of it is very elaborately carved and lists the members of the clergy and community of St Cross, including John Watson, the master.
In fact, Arthur Conan Doyle lived nearby here and was known to have visited St Cross, and so it's said that this guy Watson was the inspiration for Sherlock Holmes's sidekick.
I love this engraving of a stagecoach drawn by horses with what looks like a highwayman pointing a pistol at it, holding the journey up. Pretty exciting for a choir stall.
This lectern dates from the 19th century. It's got this peculiar design with a parrot's head on an eagle's body to remind the congregation that the word of the Lord should not be recited parrot fashion. But what I love here is this mark, because it shows that this was basically an IKEA lectern. It was delivered in several parts and the brethren had to piece it together when it arrived.
If we head up the tower, there's evidence of the turbulence of the English Civil War. For part of the war, a parliamentarian battery was based on the nearby hill, and the brethren were required to come up the tower and be on lookout duty.
So this space up here is taking us above the nave and below the roof, which you can see here, very cobwebby. Now, you won't be surprised to hear that looking at a hill was quite a boring job, and so many of the brethren spent their time procrastinating, even doodling on the walls with this rather fine graffiti. And what looks like this kind of weird moonscape is actually the roof of the north transept. Gotta bring your hiking gear up here. And here it is, the big bell. And up we go to the heavens. So here we are on the roof of the Hospital St Cross, and you get some pretty splendid views here of the town. You can see Winchester Cathedral just above there, and down here you can see the Brethren's lodgings, and from here you realise there's perfectly manicured lawns. Woo. And here's the flagpole, which apparently used to be part of a ship's mast. Ahoy!
Another strange quirk to the story of the hospital is that King Henry VIII ordered the brethren to pray for the health of his queen, Anne Boleyn, in September 1535, only to execute her the following spring.
Ironically, almost 500 years later, scenes showing Anne Boleyn at archery practice in the BBC adaptation of Wolf Hall were filmed here in these beautiful gardens.
And of course it was in Winchester, at the cathedral, where Mary I, Queen of England, and Philip of Spain were married on the 25th of July 1554.
After staying in Southampton for a few days and making merry with the most illustrious knights of the realm, Philip headed for Winchester, accompanied by 3,000 horses and a great guard of archers and crossbowmen, all the pomp and pageantry you'd expect. But as Philip arrived in Winchester, he got a good taste of English weather and faced torrential rain.
Before he entered the city, he needed to get changed into his wedding outfit, so he stopped off at the Hospital of St Cross, just outside the city walls, and came into this room, the Tower Room.
It was in Here that he changed into a black velvet tunic adorned with gold braiding, white velvet breeches and jacket, and a doublet of satin, a fitting outfit to marry the Queen of England.
And the beauty of the hospital setting has captured the imagination of many visitors over the years, including the English Romantic poet John Keats, who arrived in Winchester from the Isle of Wight on the 12th of August 1819.
Keats was inspired by these idyllic surroundings, and as he retrod the path here of Henry of Blois all those years before, he conjured up what is considered one of the most perfect short poems of the English language, To Autumn.
Seasons of mists and mellow fruitfulness, close bosom friend of the maturing sun, conspiring with him how to load and bless with fruit the vines that round the thatch eaves run.
London is one of the most historic cities in the world, which means it's been home to some of the most famous executions in history. Today, I'm going to show you some of London's most famous execution sites, many of which are hidden in plain sight. I hope you're made of stern stuff, for this is not for the faint-hearted.
Just next to St Bartholomew's Hospital is one of London's most famous and oldest execution sites, Smithfield.
This area is said to be haunted by the tortured souls who met their end here. The area was originally known as Smoothfield since it was a large expanse of grass, and during the medieval era, the Elms of Smithfield was one of the most bustling places in London. There was jousting, livestock grazing here, there were summer fetes, and then the odd execution.
Some of the most famous people to have met their end at Smithfield include Scottish rebel William Wallace, who was hung, drawn and quartered in 1305, and the leader of the 1381 Peasants' Revolt, Wat Tyler, who was publicly decapitated here after fleeing from an earlier bloody exchange with the Lord Mayor of London.
Many of the Marian martyrs, that's the Protestants slaughtered under Queen Mary Tudor, met their demise here too. St Bartholomew's Hospital features this plaque to commemorate several of them. It was erected in 1870 by the Protestant Association of London.
After Smithfield fell from favour as an execution hotspot in the 1400s, the Roman road junction at Tyburn, which is located near to today's Marble Arch, became the centre of public executions.
Prisoners were taken in public procession from Newgate Prison via St Giles in the Fields and Oxford Street, which was then called Tyburn Road, to be hanged here at Tyburn Tree, which was a large triangular gallows with 3 legs that allowed many people to be hanged at the same time. Today it's marked by these 3 oak trees.
Many famous people met their ends here at Tyburn. Even the exhumed body of Oliver Cromwell was symbolically hanged here in 1661.
And Londoners, with their gallows humour, brought Tyburn into common conversation. Phrases such as "take a ride to Tyburn" and "dance the Tyburn jig" were well-known phrases in London at the time.
This is London's central criminal court, but for many years this was the site of London's most notorious prison, Newgate.
Newgate Prison was commissioned in the 12th century by King Henry II and used for more than 700 years until 1902. And it struck fear into the heart of many a Londoner, with stories of conditions being so bad that prisoners went insane and even resorted to cannibalism. Inmates in the prison have included Casanova, Rob Roy, William Kidd, Ben Jonson, and even Daniel Defoe.
And outside the prison was a gallows. It's estimated that between 1790 and 1902, over 1,000 people were executed here.
Of course, public executions were some of the most popular form of public entertainment, and on execution days, Newgate became jam-packed with thousands of spectators. A grand stage was erected to give the crowds a best view possible, and if you had the money, the Magpie and Stump Public House would happily rent out an upstairs room and provide a good hanging breakfast.
London was once home to the world's largest port, and with that came a seedy underbelly of smuggling and piracy. During the 15th century, the Admiralty decided it was time to crack down. Pirates found guilty and sentenced to death would be paraded from Marshalsea Prison in Southwark. They went across London Bridge, past the Tower of London, and finally arrived at Wapping.
The streets would be lined with spectators, and the Thames was full of boats eager to catch a glimpse of the condemned. On the way to their execution, prisoners were permitted one final quart of ale from this pub, the Turk's Head.
Then they were brought down these steps and taken somewhere along the riverfront, a place known as Execution Dock.
They would then be hanged with a short rope. This prolonged the pain of the execution since it didn't break the neck straight away. Afterwards, the dead would be left until 3 tides had washed over them. Some were the most feared and famed pirates of the age, including Captain Kidd, who was executed here in 1701.
The next stop on our grisly trail is the Tower of London. Very few people were actually executed within the grounds of the Tower of London, although this was the case with Anne Boleyn and Lady Jane Grey.
The last person to be executed in the Tower of London was Joseph Jacobs in 1941, who was executed by firing squad for being a German spy who was captured after parachuting into England during World War II.
Most who were executed in the area met their maker on this site, an area of higher ground northwest of the tower.
This is Tower Hill, and the executions would have taken place in full public view, as was the case with Thomas Cromwell and Sir Thomas More. A memorial stands on the site today. It reads, "To commemorate the tragic history and, in many cases, the martyrdom of those who, for the sake of their faith, country or ideals, staked their lives and lost." On this site, more than 125 were put to death, the names of some of whom are recorded here.
Next up is Lincoln's Inn Fields, one of London's largest public squares. This bandstand was once upon a time the site of many gruesome executions.
Anthony Babington, the leader of the 1586 Babington plot to assassinate Queen Elizabeth I and replace her with Mary, Queen of Scots, was hung, drawn and quartered here after being convicted of high treason.
Today, the area is a popular lunch destination for city workers, and all that serves as a marker of the field's grisly past is the bandstand, which stands on the site of the former scaffold.
I'm standing in front of the Palace of Westminster, and in Old Palace Yard it was here that in 1606 Guy Fawkes was hung, drawn and quartered. In the view of the building, he had been sentenced to death for trying to blow up. And just 12 years later, Sir Walter Raleigh was also executed here, with his final words being "Strike, man, strike," heard by many within the crowd. His wife carried his decapitated head around with her for many years afterwards. The first execution took place here in 1678. A poor lady named Sarah Elston was burned at the stake for killing her husband, and later on more than 100 men and women were executed at the gallows on the site of St Mark's Church. Later there were 17 Jacobite rebels also hanged, drawn and quartered here after the unsuccessful 1745 uprising. So there you have it, the most grisly historic tour of London. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to click subscribe. Founded by the Romans almost 2,000 years ago, London is a city teeming with history. There's been everything from rebellions to regicides to executions to fire. I've selected 8 of the capital's most historic streets where London's grisly past really makes its presence felt. Let's go! For 4 centuries, Tower Hill was where nobles imprisoned in the Tower of London here met their gruesome ends. The street hosted its first public execution in 1381 when the Archbishop of Canterbury, Simon Sudbury, had his head hacked off by a mob in the Peasants' Revolt.
The last was the beheading of the Scottish Jacobite rebel Simon Fraser, 11th Lord Lovat, in 1747.
But there's more to Tower Hill than gory spectacle. One of the oldest parts of the city, it was the site of a Bronze Age settlement and is also home to remnants of the London Wall, built by the Romans to protect the city around 200 AD. Cute couple alert.
Part of the old Roman road to Colchester, Whitechapel Road has long been associated with the Whitechapel murders, attributed to Jack the Ripper.
In 1888, the body of one of the first victims, Martha Tabram, was found stabbed 39 times in the street's George Yard building.
Around the same time, Joseph Merrick, known as the Elephant Man, was displayed here as an attraction in the back room of a shop and later moved into the Royal London Hospital opposite.
In 1936, Oswald Mosley and his British Union of Fascists were blocked from marching along Whitechapel Road during the Battle of Cable Street. The road's Blind Beggar pub is also famous as the spot where both the Salvation Army began in 1865 and where, 100 years later, the notorious gangster Ronnie Cray shot rival George Cornell.
The ancient heart of the UK capital, the City of London is brimming with history, and Cornhill is one of the most important thoroughfares.
At one end sits the neoclassical Royal Exchange building, once a hub for city traders. At the other is the Christopher Wren 1667 St Peter upon Cornhill Church, which claims to occupy London's oldest Christian site, dating from 179 AD.
Running off it, Change Alley was the site of Jonathan's and Garraway's coffee houses, where the city's original traders started in the 17th century. The former was the first place to post share and commodity prices in 1698, while the latter was the first place in England to sell tea.
Just south of the river, Tooley Street gets its name from the now demolished St Olaf's Church, itself named after Norway's King Olaf. In the 11th century, the future Norwegian monarch helped England's Ethelred the Unready against the city's Danish occupiers by pulling down nearby London Bridge with his longboats.
In 1861, the Tooley Street fire devastated the area. The blaze took 2 weeks to fully put out and led to the establishment of the capital's public-run fire brigade. In 1921, it was Ernest Shackleton's polar explorer vessel Quest, which was refitted here in Hayes Wharf.
Famous residents here have included the Romantic poet John Keats, who lived nearby while studying medicine, and George Orwell, who slept in a Tooley Street doss house before writing Down and Out in Paris and London.
Not exactly a street, but this London thoroughfare oozes history from every pavement crack.
Dominated by the 52-metre Nelson's Column and flanked by the National Gallery, home to myriad old masters, the site was once prowled by cave lions, rhinos, elephants and hippos, according to excavation work. More recently, it's been the site of political rebellion. In 1848, the Chartist riots for social reform started in this square, and suffragettes were planting bombs here in 1913 and 1914. Anti-nuclear, anti-apartheid, anti-poll tax, anti-war and even anti-lockdown demos have all followed.
Whitehall takes its name from the Palace of Whitehall, where Henry VIII lived, died and married both Anne Boleyn and Jane Seymour. Charles I was headed outside its banqueting house, which is the only part that survives after fire destroyed the palace in 1698.
Sir Robert Peel set up HQ at number 4 when starting his police force in 1829, and the premises later became known as Scotland Yard. Synonymous with UK government and home to numerous ministries, Whitehall has been a target for terrorists over the years. In 1991, the Provisional IRA fired mortars from Whitehall onto the adjacent Downing Street, one of them exploding in the gardens of number 10.
Below ground, a network of secret bunkers built since the Second World War are designed to keep the country running in the event of an emergency.
Developed in the start of the 18th century and named after the military commander John Churchill, the first Duke of Marlborough, this Soho Road has been home to peers such as Lord Nelson and scientists such as Henry Cavendish and Charles Darwin.
Philip Morris, which owned a factory here in 1881, named its Marlborough cigarettes after the street. Number 20 and 21, now a hotel, once housed the Marlborough Street Magistrates Court, where Charles Dickens worked as a reporter and Oscar Wilde stood trial in 1895.
Rock stars John Lennon, Mick Jagger and Keith Richards have all faced a judge here too.
Further west, upmarket Piccadilly has been a major London artery since the Middle Ages. Its name comes from local tailor and landowner Robert Baker, who made his fortune here by selling piccadilles. These were big lace collars which were trendy in the 17th century, and he lived in Piccadilly Hall.
Over the years, this long, wide street has been home to aristocrats, various members of the Rothschild family, and even Count Dracula in Bram Stoker's 1897 novel. St James's Hall, which was demolished in 1905, hosted readings by Dickens and concerts by Tchaikovsky.
Fortnum and Mason opened in 1705, the Ritz Hotel opened in 1906, and the Royal Academy of Arts continue to provide links to its prestigious past.
So there you have it, London's most historic streets. Thanks so much for watching, and don't forget to click subscribe. This is Oxford, one of the most historic cities in the world. It's absolutely packed with history, and today I'm going to show you just a few of the highlights. Historic delights which anyone can see for free, secrets hidden in plain sight if you like. We'll be weaving between the university buildings, exploring everything from medieval palaces to pubs that inspired Tolkien. And I'll be showing you plaques which mark the history of executions and endeavour. There's a lot of history here, so make sure you're paying attention. These are the secrets of Oxford's streets. Oxford has a long and exciting history. The first mention of the city was in the year 911. It was named Oxnaforda under the authority of Edward the Elder, King of Wessex. And incredibly, some of the city's earliest buildings still survive. If you were visiting Oxford from the north about 900 years ago, you would have seen this building, the Tower of St. Michael. This is the oldest building in the city, dating from around 1040. It would have originally stood just beside the city wall and just within the North Gate. So it's quite incredible to think that this tower would have been standing when William the Conqueror invaded in 1066. Those are pretty sturdy foundations. Knock knock, anyone in? Out of use. In the 1070s, a Motte and Bailey castle was erected here by the Norman Baron Robert D'Oyley. This little green hill is all that survives of the original Motte and Bailey structure, although later parts of the castle do survive, now a popular tourist attraction. But the most exciting part of the castle's history came in the 12th century, during the Anarchy. Empress Matilda was imprisoned here, but in 1141 she made an audacious escape. Oxford was covered in snow and the river was frozen over, and she wore white as camouflage. She was lowered out of her windows along with 4 knights and slipped away into the night unnoticed. Many people probably don't pay much attention to the plaque on Beaumont Place, but this actually marks what was once a royal palace, Beaumont Palace.
It was built on the orders of Henry I, the youngest son of William the Conqueror, around 1130, and it was not far from his royal hunting lodge at Woodstock, now the location of Blenheim Palace.
And it was here that two English kings were born. As the plaque says, King Richard I was born here in 1157 and King John 10 years later in 1167.
This is Broad Street, and right in the centre of the road is something quite peculiar, a small area paved with granite setts forming a cross. This is known as the Martyr's Cross, and it commemorates one of the most grisly episodes in Oxford's past, dating from the reign of the Catholic Queen Mary I, who made it her mission to reverse the religious reforms of her father, Henry VIII, and brother, Edward VI.
During this period, Protestants were persecuted, and it was on this spot, which was once the ditch on the edge of the town, that the Protestant bishops, Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury, Nicholas Ridley, the Bishop of London, and Hugh Latimer, the Bishop of Worcester, were burnt at the stake in the 1550s.
And around the corner is the Martyrs' Memorial, built in 1843 to mark those terrible years of discord and persecution.
Next to the Martyrs' Memorial is the Ashmolean Museum, one of my favourite places to visit in the city. It was established in the 17th century to display the cabinet of curiosities owned by Elias Ashmole, who gave the museum its name. It's full of pretty incredible treasures, the death mask of Oliver Cromwell, the Alfred Jewel, and the lantern that Guy Fawkes carried during the gunpowder plot of 1605. And it's got a pretty good cafe.
This is one of the most iconic buildings of Oxford, the Radcliffe Camera. It is named after John Radcliffe, a physician who left £40,000 in his will to start the building works. It's called camera because in Latin this is the word for room, although it's commonly known as the Radcam. It's designed in a neoclassical style.
It was built by James Gibbs between the years 1737 and 1749, and it's still used by students to this day. In fact, underneath this square there is apparently space for 600,000 books, which is a lot of reading. This is the magnificent Christ Church College, the largest of the University of Oxford. It was founded by Henry VIII and built under the supervision of Cardinal Wolsey. And many of the students here have gone on to become pretty successful. They've had 13 British Prime Ministers and 17 Archbishops, as well as people like Lewis Carroll, John Locke, and even King Edward VII. And here's a little handy tip if you're ever visiting Oxford or Cambridge, because people do get a bit touchy about this sort of thing. In Oxford, all of the large rectangular inner green spaces within the colleges are called a quadrangle or a quad, but in Cambridge they are called a court. Important. Behind me is the Tower of Five Orders, and this is a brilliant architectural lesson because it shows the development of the classical orders of architecture. So at the bottom we have the Tuscan, then the Doric, Ionic, Corinthian, and then Composite. At the bottom they're quite thick, quite stout, quite what they would call masculine. At the top they get more elegant and more refined. So it's a bit like a tiered wedding cake. Delicious. This is one of my favourite architectural details to spot, these helical columns. These are called Solomonic columns, and they were named so because they're traditionally believed to have been in the ancient temple of Solomon. Wavy.
Behind Merton College is a very exciting plaque. This marks the location where, in 1784, a pastry chef named James Sadler set off on an audacious mission.
He made the first hot air balloon journey by an Englishman ever, rising from Christchurch Meadows here to a height of about 3,600 feet and landing in a place called Wood-Eaton, about 6 miles away.
This postbox in the north of the city may look like nothing particularly remarkable, but it actually has its own blue plaque dedicated to Sir James Murray.
Murray was the editor of the Oxford English Dictionary, and he sent so many letters to complete this epic tome that the Royal Mail decided to install a postbox outside his house to accommodate his vast correspondence. And here's a bit of postbox trivia for you. This is actually quite a unique, unusual example for the late Victorian age, because most of them were hexagonal in shape, whereas this one's round, a style that was brought in 1879. And it is an anonymous pillar box. This means that it doesn't have the words Royal Mail or, as you'll usually find, the cipher of the reigning monarch. The best place to eat in Oxford, if I say so myself.
Some of the most famous stories surrounding Oxford are connected to a group called the Inklings, a writers' group which included C.S. Lewis, author of The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe, and J.R.R. Tolkien, who wrote The Lord of the Rings.
The Inklings would meet to read and discuss various material, including their unfinished manuscripts, but sometimes they'd gather in the various Oxford pubs. On Monday or Tuesday lunchtimes, they'd come here to the Eagle and Child in a private lounge in the back of the pub called the Rabbit Room. And it was at one of these gatherings in June 1950 that C.S. Lewis distributed the proofs for The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe.
And it's believed that Lewis was inspired by the magic of Oxford streets to write his Tales of Narnia. Lewis, who was born in Belfast, came to Oxford as a student and lived here for much of his life, studying and teaching.
The story goes that C.S. Lewis stumbled out this doorway in Brasenose College. It was a snowy night and he came upon this solitary lamppost. And then further along St. Mary's Passage, he came across this doorway with this lion-like face in the centre, a sort of green man figure. And it's flanked by these two fawns, these creatures which are half man and half goat.
So, as legend would have it, this is the spot where Narnia came to C.S. Lewis's imagination, complete with lamppost in the snow, Aslan the lion, and even Mr. Tumnus the fawn. Is the speculation true? Who knows?
But it does feel like rather a coincidence, don't you think? Let me know your thoughts in the comments. What do you think, Mr. Tumnus?
Lewis died in 1963 and was buried at a cemetery in the north of Oxford, and you can still see his grave today. Nearby, inside the church, is an etched glass window showing characters from Narnia. Tolkien too was buried in Oxford at Wolvercott Cemetery beside his wife, Edith. But one of the most surprising features to see in Oxford can be found in Headington, in what was once a row of terrace houses.
On the 9th of August 1986, one of these residents did something quite unusual. Bill Hine was a local radio presenter, and on the roof of his house, he installed an enormous shark.
Hine was making a statement against nuclear weapons, with the shark being used as a metaphor for falling bombs. Of course, the council found this a bit fishy, and so they made all sorts of objections. But in the end, the shark was allowed to stay, and now it's become quite a popular feature of the area.
So there you have it. Those are the secrets of Oxford streets. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. This is Cambridge, one of the most historic, beautiful cities in the world. It's also home to an incredible university, and with it, quite a lot of pretty brainy people. In this video, we'll be looking at everything from Oliver Cromwell's decapitated head to Newton's apple tree. We'll be looking at student pranks and world-changing discoveries. These are the secrets of Cambridge's streets and waterways. Ahoy!
There have been settlements on the site of Cambridge since ancient times, and it was here, on this grassy mound, that they discovered archaeological evidence of the Iron Age settlement dating from the 1st century BC.
When the Romans arrived, they developed this into a fort, and many centuries later, in 1068, 2 years after the Norman conquest, William the Conqueror built his own castle here, the moat of which still survives to this day. And it was a good choice because it's got magnificent views of the surrounding countryside.
The name Cambridge probably derives from the Roman Camboricum, meaning passage or ford. Indeed, the city is intersected by the famous River Cam, and so the best way to see the city, some say, is from the waters. All aboard everybody, time to go punting.
We have hired a boat from Scudamores on Mill Lane, setting off down the backs. Wish us luck. Oh. What do they say about never stand up on a boat? Right. We're off. Ahoy! Everyone behave. Okay.
It's actually quite tricky. We're travelling along a section of the river called the Backs because the buildings which surround us are the backs of the university colleges. Clever.
Now, punting is actually quite a challenging experience, but it's okay once you get the hang of it. You stand at the back of the punt. This is called a till in Cambridge, or a swim in Oxford, and then you bring the pole up vertically and drop it in the water behind the punt, and then just push down, and then you can kind of use the back as a rudder. So if I pull it this way, then you'll see we're turning to the left. Or, to use proper nautical language, we're turning starboard.
Jerome K. Jerome wrote about punting in his book, 3 Men in a Boat. This is what he said.
Punting is not as easy as it looks. As in rowing, you soon learn how to get along and handle the craft, but it takes a long practice before you can do this with dignity and without getting the water all up your sleeve. This is King's College Chapel in Cambridge, and it's one of the finest examples of Gothic architecture in the world. It's typical of the late Perpendicular Gothic in England, as demonstrated by the great soaring towers, the enormous pointed window flooding the interior with light, all of which is decorated with much tracery and elaboration. And inside is the largest example of fan vaulting ever built.
It is remarkable then that this triumph of beauty was created during some of England's darkest days, the Wars of the Roses. In fact, 5 monarchs oversaw its completion. Construction began in 1446 and it was finally completed under Henry VIII in 1515.
William Wordsworth was certainly impressed with King's College. He called it an immense and glorious work of fine intelligence.
We're heading under the mathematical bridge.
Oh, there's a professor. He's got a tweed coat on.
Further along the river is the Bridge of Sighs, an iconic feature of St John's College. It's named after the Bridge of Sighs in Venice. That's the one connected to the Doge's Palace.
It was built in 1831 in the Gothic Revival style, and it's been featured in many films, including The Theory of Everything from 2014. But it has also been the victim of quite an audacious student prank. In June 1963, a group of students made a raft along the River Cam out of 4 punts lashed together. On this raft, they managed to place a car, a 1928 Austin 7. The students then punted the car along the river to the Bridge of Sighs and hoisted it up under the bridge, where it was left to hang for the university porters to discover it the following morning. So, good to hear that rigorous Cambridge education being put to good use. And we've arrived. Good to be back on dry land. Whew. What an adventure.
Just around the corner is the main street in Cambridge, King's Parade, so named because of King's College, which dominates it. And one of the most peculiar monuments is the Corpus Clock, a fascinating object.
Its face is plated in pure gold, and these radiating ripples are supposed to allude to the Big Bang, the event that formed the universe and could be considered as the beginning of time. This grasshopper-like creature here is a chronophage, meaning a time eater, and here it is devouring every minute as it passes with a snap of its jaws. Now, this clock has no hands or digital numbers, so the way you tell the time is by looking at these rings. It tells us the hours on the innermost ring, then the minutes, then the seconds. And in true Cambridge style, it's got the Latin inscription, which reads, "The world and its desires pass away," basically saying the time is running out. And on that note, we better press on.
One of the oldest buildings in the city is the Round Church.
It was built around 1130, its shape being inspired by the rotunda of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, and it's one of the 4 medieval round churches still in use in England, one of which being Temple Church in London, which you can find out all about if you watch this video. This little plaque marks something quite remarkable, what some people have called the birthplace of the Reformation in England. It is the site of the White Horse Inn, known as Little Germany, where Cambridge scholars would debate the works of Martin Luther in the early 16th century. This is Sydney, Sussex, locally known as Sydney Sainsbury's because of its proximity to the supermarket. But although it might look like quite an idyllic little college, it's got some pretty morbid history.
Following the English Civil War and Commonwealth, Charles II was restored as King of England, and taking revenge on Oliver Cromwell, he dug up Cromwell's grave, hanged it in chains at Tyburn, and had it beheaded. Cromwell's body was then thrown into a common grave with his head put on a spike outside Westminster Hall for 30 years.
During a storm in 1685, Cromwell's head reportedly fell from the spike and was thrown to the ground. The story goes that a guard found the head, removed the spike and took it home. Over the years it's been in collections, put on display, and it was finally buried in a sacred space, the chapel of this college, Sydney, Sussex, in an unmarked grave. And even those who know where it is are sworn to secrecy.
This is one of the most magnificent pieces of architecture in Cambridge, the gate of Trinity College. We have a statue of the college founder, Henry VIII, in a niche above the doorway.
Originally, Henry was depicted holding a sword, but you'll notice he now holds a chair leg, bizarrely replaced over the years. Just one of those Cambridge quirks. And beneath Henry's statue are the coats of arms of Edward III and his 5 sons who survived to maturity, as well as William of Hatfield, whose shield is blank. This is because he died as an infant before being granted arms.
Nearby is the flower of Kent apple tree, growing just outside the entrance to Trinity College, and it is known as Newton's apple tree.
It was grafted from the actual tree which resides at Newton's childhood home in Lincolnshire. That's the tree where Newton first saw the apple fall from its branch, which supposedly helped form his ideas around gravity.
Newton actually came to study at Cambridge in 1661, but due to an outbreak of the bubonic plague, he returned home in a few years, which is lucky for us, because it was at this point that he made the great apple discovery. And tucked behind Trinity College is Trinity Hall. This is one of the smallest of the Cambridge colleges.
It was founded in 1350 by Bishop Bateman of Norwich to provide for a new set of clergy and lawyers in the wake of the Black Death.
This is Senate House, designed by James Gibbs and built in the 1720s out of Portland stone in the neoclassical style.
This is supposed to be one of the most important buildings of the university, used for meetings of the Senate and graduation ceremonies. But the students haven't always treated it with such decorum. Like the Bridge of Sighs, it's been subject to various student pranks. They managed to place a battered Austin 7 van on the roof in 1958 and a fully decorated Christmas tree in November 2022. Which is pretty impressive, if you ask me.
This is the Eagle Pub, and for decades it was the local watering hole for scientists from the nearby Cavendish Laboratory.
And it was here on the 28th of February 1953 that Francis Crick and James Watson made the first public announcement that they had found the secret of life. What they and other scientists such as Rosalind Franklin had discovered was something pretty important: how DNA carries genetic information. See, you always come up with good ideas when you go to the pub.
But the most important part of Cambridge's long and illustrious history came in 1920 with the arrival of the famous bakery Fitzbilly's, still going to this very day.
Ooh. 2 Chelsea buns, please. Wonderful, thank you. Well. These ultra sticky Chelsea buns are Fitzbilly's most famous and most popular product. On busy days, they'll bake and sell 800 buns. The head baker has been there for 50 years, and it's estimated that she has made 5 million buns. That's enough to stretch from Cambridge to the International Space Station. So there you have it. Those are the secrets of Cambridge's streets. Thanks so much for watching, and we'll see you next time. Cheers! Delicious. This is Salisbury Cathedral, one of the most impressive and fascinating medieval buildings in Britain. Today, exclusively for the History Hit YouTube channel, we're going to peel back the layers of the past and uncover some of the most intriguing snippets of hidden history that you've probably never heard about. I'm talking demon batting graffiti, England football shirts, and even a reality TV show. I hope you're sitting comfortably because there's a lot to discover. These are the secrets of Salisbury Cathedral. So here we are, one of the greatest architectural marvels in Britain, and a building steeped in 800 years of history. But it all started with an argument.
The original cathedral was built 2 miles away at a site known today as Old Sarum. This had originally been an Iron Age hill fort, then a Roman encampment, then a Saxon fort, before reaching its glory as a Norman bastion.
A cathedral and a royal castle was built there by William the Conqueror after the Norman conquest. It was a pretty important place, and it's even believed that the Domesday Book, the survey of land ownership in England, which was ordered by the king in 1086, was written by priests there. But by 1217, the bishops and priests at Old Sarum had started to complain. It's too cramped, they grumbled, it's noisy and cold, and the water supply is awful. Once more, we're finding it hard to work with the castle guards. All in all, it's just not a suitable working environment.
And so in 1218, Pope Honorius III gave in. He issued a papal bull, and a new cathedral was to be built on a new site in the river valley below. This was New Sarum, or Salisbury.
How exactly did they choose the location? Well, the legend goes that the bishop shot an arrow in the air, declaring, "Where this lands I will build my new church." The arrow hit a white stag, and the spot which it died was chosen as the location for the new cathedral.
Work on the new cathedral started straight away, and the foundation stones were laid on the 28th of April 1220. The ceremony was watched by a great crowd of people who shouted and wept for joy.
The materials were brought to the site by men, women and children, working, carrying goods, tending to animals and providing food and drink. By 1258 the cathedral was consecrated, and within just 38 years they had completed the main body of the cathedral, so everything but the tower and the spire. That's pretty speedy as cathedrals go.
Because this first stage was completed so quickly, it had a single consistent architectural style, the early English Gothic. It used 70,000 tons of stone, 3,000 tons of timber and 450 tons of lead.
It was during these years that the city of Salisbury was laid out on a grid system, and it was in the 1300s that they completed the cathedral by adding the spire, which at 123 metres is now the tallest in the country.
All the stone here was prepared on site in the stonemason's yard.
Hiya, Gary.
Hi Alice, how are you?
Hi, good to see you.
And you?
Yeah, not too bad, thanks.
Good. So we're in the drawing office now of the stonemason's yard, and we're working on this elevation of the cathedral here, which is the east end, which is the oldest part of the cathedral. 1220 they started, and we need to replace over 1,100 stones just on that elevation.
Wow. Gosh.
Through all the wind and the erosion. And these are the drawings of this blue area.
Wow.
And all the red that you see dotted over the drawings is stone replacements. And generally, as a rule of thumb, the higher up you go, the more stone replacements you get due to the wind and the rain and certain elements. And what happens is these all get marked on by the cathedral architect. It goes to various committees in order to get approved. Once it's been approved, the mason can go onto the scaffold armed with their tape measure and their notepad, and they take the measurements and the templates, and then they bring it back into the drawing office here, and they will set it all out on card like this. Once it's been done on card, this will stay in here. We then produce a plastic template, which is exactly the same, which then will go out into the saw shop for the sawyer to choose the correct block of stone. And he will saw it 6 sides into a 3D shape and try and cut out as much of the waste as he can to make it easier for the stonemasons to work, basically.
Okay. So what's this wall then, here?
It's called the inspiration wall,
Okay.
and this is where the stonemasons will come. If there's a piece of carving on the cathedral, generally it's eroded away so much that you can't really tell what it is, so they come in here to get inspiration because they will have to design something from scratch. Either a head, for instance, we've got a lot of sheep's heads on the tower, or wolf's heads, or even human heads. Or it could be a bit of stiff leaf carving like this. So it needs to be Gothic in style, but Gothic generally means the chisel goes in quite far, so you can get a lot of shadow. But with that, you get a few issues with stones falling off years to come. But it looks incredible, especially from the ground.
Amazing.
So we're in the banker shop now. It's quite loud because we've got an extraction system on, which sucks the fine dust out of the end of the chisels that you can see there.
Oh yeah, going up here.
Yeah. So this is Joe. He's our new apprentice, and what he's doing as one of his tasks, he's working a block by hand using the traditional technique, and it is a lot harder than you think because that surface needs to be completely flat.
Okay.
So if it's not, he needs to take it down again and again. So basically masonry is flat surfaces and chamfers if you break it down, and then you add all the other bits later. This is Carol, and Carol's working a lower weathering stone on the cathedral. And she's not using a mallet at the moment, she's using what they call a metal dummy. Okay. It's a bit more responsive, metal on metal, and she's using a gouge. So All of these chisels, really, they're kind of what the medieval masons used to use. Nothing much has changed, apart from, just feel the weight of that.
Yeah, it's
and
heavy, isn't it?
feel how sharp it is. It is extremely sharp. Yeah. The only thing we've added now is a thin sliver of tungsten at the end of the chisel, because it lasts a lot longer. And it stays sharper for longer and gives you a better cut in the stone. So if you work a stone with a sharp chisel, it will last longer in the building.
And how long has Carol been working on this, and how long will it take to complete this piece?
I think she's been working on this for several days, so it might be another couple of days, so 3 or 4 days in total.
Okay.
But most of it was sawn already, as we saw before, and this big piece was cut out on the saw just to make it a lot easier and speed the process up.
Cool.
And then they generally put their banker mark on their stones.
Oh, right. So do we have any of these that we can see?
Yeah, we have. You can see here, this is a bit of stiff leaf carving.
Yeah.
But here you've got a gecko carved into there.
How beautiful.
Yeah, it is lovely, isn't it?
It's amazing how much detail they put in, considering they're so far away.
Yeah, they're so high up, yeah. But you know, when they were building a cathedral 800 years ago, it didn't matter where it was on the building, it was still just as good quality.
Yeah.
Because God can see everywhere, basically.
There are some extraordinary and exquisite designs in here. The attention to detail was truly breathtaking. And without further ado, it was time to ascend the cathedral and see some of the stonework on display in situ.
I just wanted to show you this because it's very rare that we get to replace quite a few stones, all new, in a run. Generally, we will replace one stone, leave the other, and vice versa. But here, look, you can see all new stones have recently been added, and this is called dogtooth string course. And the reason why it's called dogtooth, because it resembles a canine tooth from a distance, basically.
And that's quite a traditional medieval style, isn't it?
Yeah, it's really deep cut in order for you to get the shadow from the ground. And then these are called double springers because they spring either side, basically. Okay. So it's perfectly symmetrical, each of those.
It's beautiful.
Yeah, it is lovely, isn't it?
Oh, look at this.
So we're now at the top of St Stephen's Chapel on the East End, and this is the gable. So they've just recently fixed this gablet stone with fleur-de-lis on each side, and you've got a circular drum. And then on top of that is going to be a cross with a cross piece that they're going to fix probably tomorrow. Okay. And it's just literally been fixed within the last 10 minutes or so.
Wow, look at that, so brand new, the newest piece of Salisbury Cathedral.
Yeah. And the reason why this is a different colour to this is because this has been wet and that's dried out. So once it all gets wet, it'll all be the same colour.
I'm not sure I understand.
Oh. Sorry about that.
Don't worry, Gary, I understand you. After my tour with the stonemasons, it was time to head down to the morning chapel, where there is clear evidence that the builders of the cathedral were finding the job quite a challenge.
This is a ledger tomb. That just means a tomb which is flat. And if you look carefully, you can see a mason, perhaps after a long day of work, was carving out the word cathedrals. And he made a mistake, missing out the H, and he's trying to squash it in above here.
Another unusual detail in the morning chapel is this carved figure, who appears to be of North African descent.
Well, some have suggested this could be Saint Maurice. This seems hard to believe when he's depicted as full of character, not like the usual formal depiction you see with saints. The general consensus within the cathedral is that he might have been one of the stonemasons, and so he could have been working on this very building. This is a chantry chapel. Chantry chapels were mostly built from the 1300 to the 1530s. It was a place to chant or sing prayers to God for a dead person's soul. Originally, this would have been decorated with bright colours and all sorts of statues. It would have been a beautiful space. My favourite detail is this carved butterfly above the entrance. We have no idea why it's there though. This is the tomb of one of the earliest of Salisbury's bishops, Bishop Osmond, who had accompanied William, Duke of Normandy to England. He was made a saint in 1457, and that meant the cathedral could tap into the lucrative trade of pilgrimages. The holes in the sides of the tomb are called foramina, and they allowed sick people to reach in, perhaps put an injured arm or leg in, get close to Osmond's body, and hope that it might be cured.
Bishop Osmond had originally been buried at Old Sarum, but they dug up his remains and reburied him here 120 years after his death, and gave him a great lavish shrine which was dazzlingly ornate. Of course, this great shrine is nowhere to be seen. Like so many, it was destroyed under the orders of Henry VIII.
This is the tomb of William Longsby. His nickname Longsby is generally taken as a reference to his great physical height and the enormous weapons that he used. He was the first person to be buried in Salisbury Cathedral. He was the illegitimate son of Henry II, and so the half-brother of King Richard and King John. But his birthright was recognised, and he was given the hand of marriage to Ella of Salisbury, the richest woman in the country. They were happily married and they had 8 children. But almost 3 decades into their marriage, William, after spending some time abroad, suddenly went missing. In his absence, a man named Hubert de Burgh approached Ella and proposed that she marries his own nephew. Ella refused. Soon after, her husband William emerged from this mystery disappearance. It turned out his ship was nearly lost in a storm, and while returning to England in 1225, he spent some months in refuge in a monastery on a French island. Hubert made his profuse apologies and invited them over for a banquet to clear the air, a great gesture of friendship. But not long after this, William died, with some chroniclers claiming he was poisoned by Hubert. The story seemed to be lost to the mists of time until, when they opened up the tomb several centuries later, they found this rat amongst the bones of William Longsby. The rat had nibbled through the wooden tomb and then nibbled on the bones. And what they found is that this rat died of arsenic poisoning.
It's a murder mystery worthy of any Agatha Christie novel. And there are plenty more weird and wonderful delights in Salisbury Cathedral too.
This is the bumping stone. When a new chorister joins the choir, his head is gently bumped 7 times on this stone to mark his official entry. It's different for girls. When they join the choir, they are bumped on the head 7 times with a large prayer book. Here we go. Welcome to Salisbury Cathedral Choir. Kind of comfy, actually. In 1445, it was decided that the priests needed a dedicated space for serious study, and so a library and lecture room were built above the cloisters. In the library, the books were chained to the shelves to stop them being borrowed. In the library today, there are around 12,000 books, including some of which that date back to the 9th century, which were written in the original cathedral of Old Sarum. This is one of my favourite books in the library. It's the Theatrum Botanicum, which was by John Parkinson. And he was pretty well connected at the time. He became the apothecary to James I and the botanist to Charles I. And this book is just full of these incredible illustrations. I love this page. The common mugwort. Here's the small mugwort. The fruitful mugwort. Useful. The cathedral has thousands of pieces of graffiti all over it. Look at these circular marks opposite the pulpit. These were designed to entrap evil spirits. The concentric circles were supposed to attract the demon's eye. Once it had followed the circles to the centre, so the theory went, it would be unable to escape.
The most impressive feature of the cathedral is probably the tower with its great spire, which has been described as cloud-busting. For many years it has been used as a beacon for those travelling to Salisbury from miles around. However, the spire has proved to be troublesome. Together with the tower, it added 6,500 tons to the weight of the abbey, and so was quite precarious. Indeed, the spires of Malmesbury Abbey, Lincoln Cathedral, Old St Paul's Cathedral and Chichester Cathedral all collapsed, and Salisbury's spire would have met the same fate had it not been supported by buttresses, bracing arches and anchor irons over the centuries.
Confident in the structure's rigidity, I headed up the tower's spiralling stairs, round and round, up and up.
And look at this detail on the west window. These stained glass shields date from the 13th century. This one bears the coat of arms of Eleanor of Provence. This one shows the French fleur-de-lis, and this one shows the coat of arms of King Henry III. You might recognise it because these are the 3 lions of the England football shirts. These are put log holes, literally for putting logs in. They're kind of remnants of the medieval scaffolding, and there used to be beams that would be in here. And you can even see there are some beams that have been left in place. In 1668, Christopher Wren visited the cathedral to inspect the roof and see how it might be strengthened. He recommended, we think, some of these diagonal beams, and these were actually taken from ships' masts, cut in two. This is the clock chamber, and it's a real hodgepodge of supports and beams which are trying to strengthen this lower part of the tower over the years. We've got a mixture of Victorian and medieval and ones from all parts of history. And you can see there's a lot of tension in this room. Here are some ties which were put in by Christopher Wren, and this one here is bent under the pressure, and there's even one in this corner which has snapped completely.
And up I climbed once again, around these great set of wooden spiralling stairs, up to the bell chamber.
Now up here in the bell chamber is quite a remarkable piece of graffiti. It's from William Gerard, who was up here collecting birds' eggs for his dinner. But something went wrong and he's recorded it here. It reads, William Gerard fell from this pier, spelt pear, on the 29th day of March, 1864 AD. But he was fine, he survived the mishap. Luckily, he was wearing a cloak and it got caught on one of the cathedral pinnacles and he was left hanging to be rescued.
Very much hoping I would not replicate William's accident, I travelled even further up the tower to some pretty dizzying heights.
Up here from the base of the spire, it's quite high up, I'm not sure if I really like it, but you do get amazing views of the city and beyond. So you can see the High Street, you can see St Thomas's Church, and beyond that you can see Old Sarum, that flat-topped hill. That's where the old cathedral used to be. Oh, look at this. Now you might think that we're pretty high up here already, but we're not even halfway up to the top of the spire. This is where we are here with the windlass at the bottom, and then there are 10 more ladders to go to this point here, and then there's a door that takes you to the outside, and for the last few meters you've got to climb up yourself.
Luckily, we weren't able to reach the dizzying heights of the top of the spire, and I was quite relieved when we finally returned back to ground level.
And if you stand beneath the spire and look up at the supporting pillars, you'll notice they actually curve under the weight above. Supports were added, of course, which meant it hasn't actually collapsed yet. It wasn't just the spire which has been the source of architectural angst. The cathedral has foundations that are only 4 feet deep. It's built on the gravel floodplain of the River Avon, the watery base holding everything in place. If this base dries out, the whole church will come tumbling down. So every day, somebody comes here, lifts this small stone in the nave and sticks this long dipping stick into the foundations to make sure there's still water beneath. Now, normally this is done by a cathedral guide, but I got special permission today to just give it a little wiggle. And then out it comes. And look, there's the water line, which means we're still safe. Phew. Because of these foundations, there's no crypt in Salisbury Cathedral and no burials under the floor either. So why are there tombstones here on the ground? Well, for hundreds of years they buried the dead outside in a graveyard, but in the 1780s, when funds were low and they needed to patch up the floor, they simply borrowed a few from outside.
This octagonal room with its slender central pillar is the chapter house. It's got an amazing medieval frieze showing stories from the books of Genesis and Exodus, including Adam and Eve, Noah, the Tower of Babel, and Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob.
In the centre is the bishop's seat, and they put on display here the mitre, that's the hat, and the crook, this stick which is still used as part of the bishop's official dress. A crook is used by shepherds to herd sheep and refers to a bishop's role in leading the faithful, following the model of Jesus. But what I love here is this three-faced figure. This might have represented the Trinity or suggested that the bishop was an all-seeing figure.
And behind this curtain is perhaps the most important historical document in British history. It is Magna Carta, Latin for the Great Charter. Only 4 copies of Magna Carta dating from 1215 have survived the ravages of time, and the one in Salisbury is the best preserved.
Magna Carta is a Charter of Rights which was agreed by King John in 1215, and it marked the first time there had been an attempt to officially limit the powers of the king. It was so significant it's played an important role in British and international human rights ever since. It was written in medieval Latin, and they used quill pens on sheets of parchment made from sheepskin. In some of the later versions they have a great royal seal which was added by an official called a spigurnal, who made the seal using a special seal press using beeswax and resin. Recently, the very survival of the Magna Carta was put into doubt. Shortly before 5 p.m. on the 25th of October 2018, just as the cathedral was winding down for the day, disaster struck. A man wielding a hammer made his way to the Magna Carta and began smashing the glass case. The arms went off, surrounding around the whole cathedral. The man was wrestled to the ground and the cathedral was evacuated.
Luckily, the cathedral's security system stood up to the test and the precious document remained unharmed. Now, there is absolutely no excuse to be late for anything here, for Salisbury Cathedral has the oldest working mechanical clock in the world. This was made in 1386 and, incredibly, it still works.
Where's the clock face, I know you're thinking? Well, it doesn't have one. In fact, this wasn't even used to tell the time. This was to tell you the hours of prayer, and it would tell you this by ringing out on the hour. The mechanism here is driven by falling weights, which have to be wound up once a day. It was in operation until 1884, when it was placed in storage and forgotten, until someone found it in an attic in 1928, and they finally got it going again in the 50s. To date, it has ticked more than 5 billion times.
Of course, the English Civil War left its mark here too. In 1644, the cathedral was plundered by a parliamentarian force and its plate and vestments sent to London to be shown before the House of Commons.
The heaviest fighting in the city was towards the end of the war in 1644 and 1645. When the parliamentarians barricaded themselves into the belfry, the royalists set fire to the door and smoked them out. And there were Dutch prisoners here in the cloisters who made a real mess of the place, breaking windows and damaging the pillars. By 1653, the mayor of Salisbury was so fed up of dealing with this mess, he wrote to the government to ask them for their removal. So it was probably one of those pesky Dutch prisoners, perhaps yearning for his own cat at home, who made this little sketch.
But despite this, the cathedral stayed intact. This was because the local gentry, who so loved the cathedral and hated to see the damage, secretly employed workmen to repair it.
When asked who paid them, the workmen answered, "They who employ us will pay us. Trouble yourself not to inquire who they are. Whosoever they be, they desire not to have their names known." Cryptic. This is the West Front, and according to the rather grand historian Alec Clifton Taylor, this is poor and insipid. Well, I think it's magnificent. It's a symphony of wonderful details: stair turrets, spiralettes, lancet windows, quatrefoils, buttresses. It's got it all.
And once more, it's attracted a big crowd. There are 79 figures on the front. 7 are from the 14th century, but many were destroyed during the Civil War, so the rest are Victorian or later.
You can see the bottom row quite clearly. Here's St. George with a shield on his left elbow and a sword in his left hand, and in his right hand is the head of a dragon looking quite sad. There's St. Sebastian, who's tied to a tree and shot with arrows, and you can see him here with his arms tied behind his back and pierced with 3 arrows. And look at this guy striking a pose. He's got his hands on his hips showing off his outfit. He's absolutely loving being out here on display on Salisbury Cathedral's West Front.
There are some beautiful buildings around the cathedral too. This is Salisbury Close, which was mainly used to house the clergy. Today, the majority of houses are leased from the cathedral by private residents.
Salisbury Cathedral really has kept up to date with the modern world, as it's got its very own 24/7 reality TV show.
The contestants, though, are a little more feathery than usual, as they come in the form of peregrine falcons. You can follow their every move by logging into the live stream of the Salisbury Cathedral website. And the cathedral is as active and changing as it's ever been, with new developments happening all the time. For example, until recently, the cathedral was without a font. The 17th century white alabaster font, which used to be in the nave, was moved to a tiny country church 50 miles south of Adelaide in South Australia in 1870, where it stands to this day.
After a century without a proper font, it was decided action needed to be taken. So the cathedral commissioned this in 2008, which the newspapers enjoyed calling the funky font. It's this unusual green patinated bronze vessel shaped in a sort of cruciform with a base of Purbeck stone. It creates this incredible mirrored flat surface. Perfect for skimming stones, I imagine.
And of course, the cathedral was brought to the world's attention on the 4th of March 2018, when Sergei Skripal and his daughter Yulia were poisoned here with Novichok. And it was here in the cathedral from January 2021 that the people of Salisbury came to receive their COVID vaccines, a day after Lincoln Cathedral did the same thing.
And whilst people were waiting for this life-saving vaccination, their visit was accompanied by heavenly music from the cathedral's magnificent organ. So there you have it, the history of Salisbury Cathedral in a nutshell. It's one of the most fascinating places for any history fan to visit, so make sure you put it on your bucket list. And if you enjoyed this video, click subscribe so you don't miss the next one. See you next time! At the start of 1612, there was nothing especially remarkable about this area of Pendle in Lancashire. It was a beautiful rural landscape marked by small villages. People's lives hadn't changed much for hundreds of years, and they had no reason to suspect this wouldn't continue. Yet in 1612, something suddenly went terribly wrong. By the end of the summer, a number of people in this community, most of them women, were left swinging from the gallows as a large crowd gathered to watch their final, excruciating moments. Their alleged crime was witchcraft.
So what on earth happened here? How had things gone so wrong in society that this could happen under the rule of law? That these people struggling to eke out a living became the subject of such fierce and condemnatory scrutiny and convicted without any solid evidence?
In this film, I'm going to get to the heart of it all. This is the story of the Pendle witch trials.
The story of the Pendle witches is not actually a story about witches or spirits as we might think of them today. It's a story, a tragedy really, of ordinary people, mainly impoverished women, living ordinary lives. And it all started right here on the 21st of March, 1612. On this very road between Trawden Forest and the market town of Colne, a local woman named Alison Devise was begging, as she so often did. A man, a peddler, John Law, passed her by. But something happened between them on this road, an incident, and it was this incident which set off a string of terrible events.
To find out what happened, I'm meeting local historian and tour guide Simon Entwistle.
So Simon, you brought me here in the shadow of Pendle Hill. Why are we here then?
Well, this pathway would have looked exactly the same as it would have done in 1612, the Colne to Trawden Road, beneath the shadow of Pendle Hill.
So Alison Devise and John Law met on this road. Can you tell me exactly what happened there?
She had a confrontation with John Law, the Halifax peddler. She begged some pins off him. He refused to take his pack off because he knew she had no money. She begged again, just a few pins, sir. All of a sudden, this huge black dog came from nowhere. The dog sat next to Alison and the dog talked. "What wouldst thou want me to do to him? I can lame him." "Lame him," she screamed. Law felt this terrible pain on his left side and collapsed in agony on the pathway between Colne and Trawden.
Okay, so it appears that John Law had been cursed, but what really happened, do you think?
It's very likely he had a stroke, but in those days it would be classed as witchcraft.
So what happened to John Law after this?
He was taken to an old alehouse. He was in a terrible state for a good 3 days. When his voice returned, he screamed out that he'd been cursed by this young girl in the forest of Pendle with a dog, and asked letters to be sent home to his family in Halifax, which they were. His eldest son, Abraham, made his way to Colne and saw his father in this twisted and contorted state. "Father, what's happened to you?" "I've been cursed, lad. Go into the woods, find this young girl called Alison Devise. She's cursed me. Find her, bring her here, reverse the curse." Abraham went into the forest of Pendle, found her, brought her back to the old alehouse, where she made eye contact with John Law. Law looked up from his sick bed. "It's you! You're the witch! You've cursed me!" She burst into tears and begged forgiveness. She had no idea she had just admitted to a state capital offence of witchcraft. And strangely enough, John Law, the Halifax peddler, was about to forgive her, but not his son Abraham. He went to see the local magistrate, Roger Noel, and in doing so, he opened what we now call the Pendle Witch Trials of 1612.
Alison Devise, along with her mother and brother, was summoned to appear before Roger Noel, where she once again confessed her crimes, apparently convinced of her own powers. When questioned about another local family who had also been tainted by accusations of witchcraft, Alison saw an opportunity to settle scores in a bitter neighbourly feud. At the heart of this story are two families. They lived a short distance from each other and their paths must have crossed on a regular basis. They were remarkably similar, both only just putting bread on the table, making a living out of begging or doing odd jobs for better off neighbours. Both were headed by a matriarch, which was an unsettling concept for people in the 17th century. At the head of one family was Elizabeth Southerns, known as Old Demdike. By 1612, she was frail and blind. At the head of the second family was Anne Whittle, known as Old Chattox. Old Chattox, like Old Demdike, was a widow. She was probably in her 80s by 1612. Now, these two families had a long-held rivalry. Old Demdike and Old Chattox must have known each other all their lives, probably being girls together, married, raised families, and were now in old age. But it was a mutual distrust bordering on hatred, a rivalry which was always there to add fuel to the fire. With several members of both families now awaiting trial for witchcraft on the orders of Roger Noel, the authorities were on high alert. So, when a large gathering of people was organised at the home of the Demdikes on Good Friday 1612, an investigation began.
Many historians believe that this very area we are now in was indeed the home of the Devise family at Malkin Tower.
Convinced that the meeting had been called for sinister purposes, everyone who attended, no matter what their connection was to the family, was implicated. Noel ordered the arrest of a further 8 people on charges of witchcraft.
The accused were made to walk 40 miles from Pendle to Lancaster to be imprisoned here at Lancaster Castle, where they spent several months awaiting trial. The original courtroom no longer exists, although there was a new courtroom built on the same site later on, which is still in use to this day. The cell where they were held, however, has survived the ravages of time.
To show me around is the museum manager of Lancaster Castle, Dr. Colin Penny.
Wow, so Colin, this is it. This is the cell where you think that the Pendle witches were held.
Yep, tradition has it that they were kept down here.
Can you tell me a bit about what the conditions would have been like down here?
Dreadful. I mean, it's July now. It's cold down here, and they were in prison from April, when it would have been very wet, probably raining a lot. Water would have been running down the walls. There's no sanitation down here, and you were eating your food in absolute filth.
And I've noticed these rings on the floor. Are they something to do with the accused that were kept here?
It's been suggested that people might have been chained to them if they were being particularly disruptive.
Now, of course, they would have been down here, those 2 rival families together. Do you think that was a tense time?
Very. Yeah, I mean, they didn't get on when they weren't in the same room. I mean, you can imagine that when they were thrown together down here, each having accused the other one, they were going to have a fair few ding-dong arguments, but they probably didn't last that long because the conditions would have taken their toll. They would have probably become quite poorly, and we know old Demdike died.
Can you just tell me a bit more about what happened there?
Well, she was in her 80s, the conditions, they were awful, and prison populations were decimated by illnesses such as typhoid, cholera, and something known as jail fever, which was typhus. That was caused by the bites from body lice. So it's quite possible that she caught one of those illnesses, and yeah, she passed away down here.
So people would have been down here in the darkness for months on end in these horrific conditions and then taken up outside into the bright light and taken to court. And could you just tell me a bit about what that experience would have been like?
First thing is they wouldn't have been able to see, probably for some time. It may very well have given them headaches and things like that. And then they're supposed to go into court and plead their case. You know, they wouldn't have been in any condition. If you think about James Device, he was a young man. And when he entered the castle, he was fit. By the time he got into the court, he could barely walk and talk.
One of the women accused of witchcraft has gained more attention than most, perhaps because she was comparatively well off. I've travelled to the village she lived in to learn more about her story.
So, Alice, we're in the village of Roughly. This is the statue of probably the most famous of all the Pendle witches, Alice Nutter.
Oh, Alice Nutter. But of course, she's not part of the Chattox family or the Demdike family. So how does she get involved in this?
She was a very wealthy lady, and she was totally different to the rest of the so-called witches in the fact that she would not need to beg. There's a lot of speculation that she may have known Roger Noel and had a land dispute with him, and won that land dispute. Noel thought, I need to get rid of this woman. How? The little girl, Jeanette Device, who testified in the courts at Lancaster that she'd been at Malkin Tower on Good Friday 1612.
So that's really interesting, isn't it? That Roger Noel had a vested interest in Alice's fall.
Very much so. Her story is shrouded in mystery, but certainly in Potts's book he mentions that she made a plea of not guilty, and many people, myself included, believe she was totally innocent of the crimes against her.
It's strange, isn't it, how Alice Nutter is the only one who's really remembered. You know, she's got a statue here and people seem to know her name. They want to be connected to her. Why do you think that is? Do you think it's anything to do with the fact that, you know, she was completely separate, she was the wealthy one and everyone else was kind of impoverished?
It's the evidence against her which I find really hard to take in. She's found guilty of aiding Demdike and Alison Device in the murder of Henry Mitten, a man who lived in this village, for a penny. She wouldn't need to beg. And it's weak evidence, but on the evidence of that little girl Jeanette, she was found guilty of his murder and aiding those two other so-called witches.
So why were there quite so many accused of witchcraft in Lancashire at this time? Well, although no one could have predicted the events of 1612, there are several long-term factors which created a perfect setting for such accusations to flourish.
Let's wind back the clock to the mid-15th century. The development of the printing press in Europe allowed many new ideas to spread fast. One publication which was immensely popular was the Malleus Maleficarum, or the Hammer of the Witches. The Malleus was effectively a manual for hunting and persecuting witches. It was first published in 1486, predating James I's demonology by quite some time, and the Malleus went much further than James I's later text. It was created by two Dominican friars, Heinrich Kramer and Jacob Sprenger, and it has been described by the historian Christine Goudier as a deeply misogynistic text. She explains that Kramer, in particular, believed that women were the weaker sex, not just physically, but morally too. He considered them tools of the devil, lustfully attempting to ensnare men, leading them away from their righteous path. So potent were some of these ideas that some believe that it was this book which was largely responsible for the large numbers of deaths during the European witch craze in the 15th, 16th and 17th centuries.
On the afternoon of Sunday, the 16th of August, two judges arrived, tired and dusty, at Lancaster Castle to preside over the assize court. They were Sir James Altham and Sir Edward Bromley. The trial began. One by one, the accused emerged from the darkness of their prison, filthy, dishevelled and confused. They were brought before a judge and a jury of 12 men chosen from the middle ranks of local society and scrutinised.
First came Anne Whittle, that's old Chattox, an elderly lady who was weak and frail. Anne was accused of the murder of a man, Robert Nutter, to which she pleaded not guilty. The event in question had happened 2 decades previously, and the evidence given was that her family were commonly reputed to be witches, and that milk turned sour at their touch. It was flimsy evidence at best. But faced with an onslaught of evidence against her, old Chattox broke down. With weeping tears, she humbly acknowledged the evidence to be true, and cried out unto God for mercy and forgiveness of her sins, and humbly prayed my Lord to be merciful unto Anne Redfern, her daughter.
Next came Elizabeth Devise, the daughter of old Demdike, who was charged of 3 counts of murder. Elizabeth was known as Squinting Lizzie because she had one eye set above the other. It was a detail that the clerk of the court, Thomas Potts, was keen to draw attention to, describing it as a preposterous mark of nature. But Elizabeth was about to face a vicious accusation, a witness of her own flesh and blood. It was her 9-year-old daughter, Janet. The moment Elizabeth saw Janet enter the court, she began to scream in such a fearful manner, it was recorded, as all the court did not a little wonder at her, and so amazed the child as with weeping tears she cried out unto my lord the judge, and told him she was not able to speak in the presence of her mother. And so Elizabeth was removed from the dock, and her daughter Janet was placed on a table in full view of the court. And there she told the court how her mother was a witch with a familiar spirit, a brown dog named Bull, and with these powers she had on 3 occasions been guilty of murder. The trial took just 2 days. Judge Bromley read out the verdict on Wednesday the 19th of August. He said, "It only remains I pronounce the judgment of the court against you by the King's authority, which is, you shall go hence to the castle from whence you came, from thence you shall be carried to the place of execution for this county, where your bodies shall be hanged until you be dead, and God have mercy upon your souls."
The Pendle witch trials resulted in 10 people being sentenced to death. on the basis of evidence that would not be admitted in regular courts. Even in the 17th century, 8 women and 2 men would face a public hanging.
Only one woman, Margaret Pearson, was allowed to live. Her punishment: she was placed in the pillories on the market day at 4 different towns. Her crime was written on a piece of paper and fastened to her head. One of these towns was Clitheroe, where we are now, and around this spot is where she would have been. She was constrained while she was then taunted and pelted with objects, and after this she was returned to the tower at Lancaster Castle and forced to endure a year longer imprisoned in those terrible conditions.
The condemned were taken up to a site known as Gallows Hill on the outskirts of Lancaster. As they headed up the slope, they may have glanced back to see one of the most magnificent views in England, that of Morecambe Bay. Having lived their entire lives inland, it's possible that this was the first time those men and women had seen the sea.
For those condemned, a priest was arranged to tend to them and advise them to repent and pray for forgiveness. Then, on Thursday, the 20th of August, they were piled into a cart and taken here, what is now Williamson Park, a hill just outside the city. We aren't sure exactly where the gallows were, but it would have certainly been in a prominent place, possibly where this Ashton Memorial now stands. A large crowd gathered as the cart was brought to a stop. It was death by strangulation, and their final moments would have been excruciating. Pendle was once a largely inaccessible part of the country, yet today people flock here. They come to see what happened to those famous witches. There are witch-themed shops and witches' brews to be bought. But the problem with this is that it puts these events in the realm of magic, of make-believe, of fantasy, whereas actually this is a story, a tragedy of ordinary people, generally women, often at the lowest levels of society. Women who, like many others, clung on to the superstitions and folklore of the day and were known to dabble in divination and spellcasting, maybe as a desperate attempt to stay above water in a tough world that they lived. There were women like this up and down the country, of course, but the difference was here in Pendle was that they were subject to ferocious scrutiny, scapegoated for random ills in society by the heavy hand of the law, all of which was driven by a complex web of external forces and personal motivations.
It wasn't until 1684, over 6 decades after the Pendle trials, that the last execution for witchcraft took place in England. By then, over 500 people had been killed by the state. James I's statute on witchcraft was eventually repealed in 1736 by George II, finally bringing an end to that dark period in the nation's history.
Thanks for watching this video on the History Hit YouTube channel. You can subscribe right here to make sure you don't miss any of our great films that are coming out. Or if you are a true history fan, check out our special dedicated history channel, historyhit.tv. You're going to love it.